Welcome, weary undead, to the fading realm of Lordran and beyond. Tonight, we delve into the darker corners of the soul's universe, where light gives way to shadow and hope transforms into something far more complex. This is a journey through the most unsettling lore of Dark Souls, the madness of gods, the curse of undeath, and the inevitable cycle of decay that defines all existence. So settle into the darkness, let your guard down, and allow these disturbing tales to wash over you like ash from a dying flame. There's no judgment here, only the truth of a world where even gods can fall to despair. In the beginning, before the concepts of light and shadow held any meaning, before the very idea of warmth could exist in opposition to cold, there was only the grey. It was not the grey of storm clouds heavy with rain, nor the gentle grey of morning mist that promises the eventual arrival of Sunday. This was something far more absolute, a colourless void that stretched across all existence like a shroud woven from the very essence of nothingness itself. The world that existed in those primordial days bore no resemblance to the lands that would later know the touch of flame and the blessing of warmth. There were no rolling hills clothed in emerald grass, no crystal streams singing their way toward distant seas, no forests where ancient trees whispered secrets to the wind. Instead, there were only vast expanses of grey stone beneath grey skies, where grey mists drifted endlessly across landscapes that had never known the caress of sunlight or the gentle embrace of shadow. This was the Age of Ancients, a time so removed from human understanding that even the gods themselves would struggle to comprehend its true nature. It was an age without change, without growth, without the possibility of transformation that would later define all living things. Here, in this realm of absolute stasis, time itself seemed to move differently, if it moved at all. Moments could stretch into eternities, while eons might pass in the space of a single breath. Yet this world was not empty, for it was ruled by beings of such immense power and ancient wisdom that they seemed to embody the very concept of immortality itself. The everlasting dragons soared through those grey skies on wings that cast no shadows, their scales gleaming with a light that was not truly light, their eyes holding depths that spoke of knowledge, accumulated across countless ages of unchanging existence. These dragons were not mere beasts, though their forms might suggest such to minds accustomed to the lesser creatures that would populate later ages. They were the architects of that grey world, the guardians of stasis, the living embodiments of a philosophy that saw change as corruption and growth as decay. In their perfect, unchanging forms, they had achieved something that all future civilizations would envy and fear in equal measure: true immortality, existence without end, being without the possibility of non-being. Their scales were not merely armor, but symbols of their transcendence over the cycle of life and death that would later define all mortal existence. Each scale was a testament to their permanence, a declaration that they had moved beyond the need for growth or adaptation, beyond the vulnerability that comes with the possibility of change. They were complete, perfect, eternal, and in that perfection lay both their greatest strength and, though they could not have known it then, the seeds of their ultimate downfall. For in the depths of that grey world, in places where even the dragon's ancient wisdom could not penetrate, something stirred that would challenge their eternal reign. It was not born of malice or ambition, for such concepts had not yet come into being. Instead, it emerged from the very fabric of existence itself, as if the universe had grown weary of stagnation and sought to birth something new, something that would bring both wonderful possibility and terrible suffering into the world. The first flame appeared without herald or announcement, blazing to life in the darkest depths of the world with a light that was unlike anything that had ever existed before. This was not the cold, grey illumination that the dragons knew, but something warm and alive, something that pulsed with the rhythm of a great heart and cast shadows that danced with their own wild energy. It was beautiful beyond description and terrifying in its implications, for it brought with it concepts that had been foreign to the age of ancients, concepts like heat and cold, light and dark, life and death. With the first flame came disparity, the force that would shatter the perfect unity of the grey world and scatter it into countless fragments of possibility. Where once there had been only sameness, now there were differences. Where once there had been only stasis, now there was change. Where once there had been only the eternal present of immortal existence, now there was time itself, flowing like a great river that carried all things toward uncertain destinations. And with disparity came souls. 4 beings found their way to that miraculous flame in those first chaotic moments after its appearance, drawn by forces they themselves did not fully understand. They were not yet the mighty lords they would become, not yet the shapers of ages that their names would suggest to future generations. In those early days, they were something far more humble and far more human seekers drawn to a source of power that promised to transform not only themselves but the very nature of existence. The first to claim his prize was the one who would become known as Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, though in those primordial moments he was merely a being who yearned for something more than the grey eternity that stretched before him. From the first flame he drew forth the Lord Soul of Light, a fragment of power so brilliant and pure that it transformed his very essence, filling him with radiance that would burn for ages uncounted. Yet even as this divine light flowed through him, even as he felt himself becoming something greater than he had ever imagined possible, there stirred within him the first whispers of the fear that would ultimately define his reign, the fear that this incredible gift might one day be lost. The Witch of Izalith approached the flame with different intentions, her heart filled not with ambition for personal power, but with a mother's desire to nurture and create. From the sacred fire she claimed the Lord's soul of life, and with it came the ability to birth flames of her own, to create warmth and comfort for those who would follow after. She saw in the fire not just power but the possibility of building something beautiful, of creating a realm where life could flourish under her protective guidance. Yet she did not understand, could not have understood, that the power to create life also carries within it the terrible responsibility of potentially destroying it. Gravelord Nito, drawn by instincts that ran deeper than conscious thought, reached into the flame and withdrew the Lord's soul of death. In that moment, he became the first being to truly understand the concept of ending, the first to comprehend that the beautiful disparity brought by the first flame carried with it not just the possibility of beginning, but the certainty of conclusion. His soul granted him dominion over that which had never existed before in the grey world, the transformation from being into non-being, the passage from existence into whatever lay beyond the veil of mortality. Yet it was the 4th seeker who claimed perhaps the most significant prize, though none who witnessed that moment could have understood its true importance. This being, so unassuming in appearance that the others barely noticed him, reached into the depths of the flame and withdrew something that seemed almost insignificant compared to the radiant power claimed by his companions. The dark soul was small and humble, easily overlooked in the presence of the spectacular energies that blazed around it. This quiet figure, who would come to be known as the furtive pygmy, understood something that his more ambitious companions had missed. The dark soul was not weaker than the others. It was different. Where their souls burned with obvious power and brilliant display, his soul contained something far more precious and far more dangerous. It contained humanity itself, the essence of what it meant to be mortal, the seed from which would grow all the joy and suffering that would define the ages to come. With their Lord's souls in hand, these four beings found themselves transformed into something the grey world had never seen: gods. They possessed power beyond imagining, the ability to reshape reality according to their will, the capacity to challenge even the mighty everlasting dragons for dominion over existence itself. Yet with this divine ascension came something that would poison every victory they achieved. The knowledge that their power was not truly eternal, that the flame which had birthed their glory was itself subject to the law of entropy that now governed all things. The war that followed was not merely a conflict between old and new, though it would be remembered that way in the ages to come. It was something far more complex and tragic: the first great lie, the original sin that would cast its shadow over every subsequent age. The dragons, in their ancient wisdom and perfect immortality, represented something that the new gods found both admirable and utterly terrifying. They were what Gwyn and his companions had given up in their pursuit of power beings who existed beyond the reach of time and change, beyond the fear of ending that now haunted every moment of divine existence. The dragons had committed no crime beyond existing in a way that reminded the gods of what they had lost. Their very presence was an accusation, a living reminder that there had once been a form of existence that did not require the constant feeding of flame, that did not depend on the willing sacrifice of others, that did not live in constant fear of entropy and ending. They were content in their immortal stasis, asking nothing from the new world that was being born around them, threatening no one with their ancient ways. Yet they could not be allowed to continue. Their very existence was a challenge to the new order that Gwyn sought to establish, a reminder that there were alternatives to the age of fire he envisioned. More than that, they possessed something that the gods desperately coveted: true immortality, existence without the need for constant renewal, being that did not depend on the feeding of flame or the sacrifice of souls. The betrayal came from within their own ranks. For among the dragons there was one who had been born different, one who had emerged into the world without the stone scales that granted his brethren their perfect invulnerability. Seath the Scaleless had spent eons watching his fellow dragons soar through the grey skies, their scales gleaming with immortal light, while he remained earthbound and mortal, cursed with the knowledge that he alone among his kind could die. When Gwyn approached him with promises of immortality, with the offer of eternal life granted through divine power rather than inborn nature, Seath saw not betrayal but salvation. He would help the gods wage war against his own kind, would share the secrets that would allow them to pierce the dragon's seemingly impenetrable defenses, would trade the lives of every other dragon in existence for the promise that he alone would survive to see whatever new age the gods would build upon the ashes of the old. The war itself was not a battle in any conventional sense, for how could there be true conflict between beings of such vastly different natures? The dragons, in their immortal wisdom, had never needed to develop the arts of warfare. They had never faced an enemy that could truly threaten them, never encountered opposition that required anything more than their simple, overwhelming presence. They were not warriors, but living embodiments of a philosophy that saw conflict itself as a form of corruption. Against such beings, Gwyn and his allies brought not honor but horror. They brought the lightning that could shatter even the toughest scales, the flames that could melt stone itself, the death magic that could unweave the very foundations of immortal existence. They brought disparity itself as a weapon, turning the dragon's greatest strength, their unity, their sameness, their perfect harmony with the grey world, into a vulnerability that could be exploited. The great arrows that pierced Dragonhide were not merely weapons, but symbols of the New Age's approach to existence. Where the dragons had sought harmony, the gods brought division. Where the dragons had embraced stasis, the gods demanded change. Where the dragons had found peace in acceptance, the gods brought the restless energy of ambition and fear. Seath's contribution to this slaughter was perhaps the cruelest element of all. His knowledge of dragon physiology, his understanding of their weaknesses and vulnerabilities, allowed the gods to wage their war with surgical precision. They did not merely kill dragons, they eliminated them as thoroughly as possible, seeking to erase not just their physical forms, but their very memory from the world that would follow. The ancient worms, whose wisdom had guided the world through eons of peaceful existence, were reduced to bones and ash. The great drakes, who had soared through those grey skies with majesty that no earthbound creature could comprehend, fell to earth with their wings torn and their fire extinguished. The lesser dragons, who had known nothing but the quiet contentment of eternal existence, died, without understanding what crime they had committed to deserve such a fate. Yet perhaps the greatest tragedy was not the death of the dragons themselves, but the transformation of their killers. Gwyn, who had begun his ascension as a being filled with the light of pure possibility, found that each dragon death dimmed something essential within him. The Witch of Izalith, whose soul had been meant for creation and nurturing, discovered that the power to destroy was far easier to wield than the power to build. Nito, who had understood death as a natural transition, learned that it could also be a weapon of conquest. And Seath, who had dreamed of gaining the immortality that had been denied him by birth, found that his betrayal had indeed granted him eternal life, but an eternity haunted by the screams of his dying kin, an endless existence poisoned by the knowledge of what he had done to achieve it. When the last dragon fell, and the grey world lay in ruins around them, the victorious gods stood amid the ashes of the age they had destroyed and contemplated what they would build in its place. The age of fire that they established was meant to be a paradise, a realm where the light of their divine power would banish all darkness and create eternal prosperity for those who dwelt within it. Yet from its very foundation, this new age was built upon a lie. The lie that their victory had been righteous, that the dragons had been enemies rather than innocents, that the slaughter had been necessary rather than an act of fear and greed. This original deception would poison every subsequent triumph, would ensure that every kingdom built in the Age of Fire carried within it the seeds of its own corruption and decay. Aenor Londo rose from the ashes of the grey world like a monument to divine ambition, its golden spires reaching toward a sun that Gwyn himself had created to replace the colourless sky of the Age of Ancients. It was beautiful beyond description, a city of light and glory that seemed to embody all the hopes and dreams that had driven the gods to their great victory. Its halls rang with laughter and music. Its streets bustled with the activity of beings blessed by divine favour. Its very stones seemed to glow with the warmth of eternal prosperity. But beneath its golden foundations lay dragon bones, and in its deepest vaults were stored the secrets of the great betrayal that had made it possible. The gods who ruled from their thrones of light knew that their kingdom was built upon the graves of innocence, that their eternal paradise was sustained by the memory of genocide, that their divine authority rested upon the precedent of might making right. This knowledge would eat at them like poison, ensuring that no victory would ever feel complete, no achievement would ever bring lasting satisfaction. They had gained the power to rule over a world of fire and light, but they had lost something far more precious in the process, the innocence that would have allowed them to enjoy their paradise without the constant whisper of guilt that reminded them of the price they had paid to achieve it. The Age of Fire had begun, but it was an age haunted by the ghosts of the Age of Ancients. an age that could never truly escape the shadow of its own origins. The cycle of light and dark, of rise and fall, of triumph and tragedy that would define all subsequent history, had its roots in this moment of victory that was also the first great defeat, the defeat of innocence, of honor, of the possibility that power could be wielded without corruption. In the halls of Anor Londo, as the gods celebrated their triumph and planned the glorious future they would build together, the first flame that had made it all possible continued to burn. But already, though none yet dared to acknowledge it, that sacred fire was beginning to fade. The very act of claiming the Lord's souls had diminished it, and every use of divine power drew further from its reserves. The age that had begun with such promise was already dying, and the gods who had thought themselves eternal were about to discover that they had traded one form of ending for another one that would prove far more terrible because it would take so much longer to arrive, allowing time for hope to take root and flourish before it too was consumed by the inevitable darkness that waits at the end of all flames. In the depths of the kingdom that would one day be called Izalith, where the very stones pulsed with warmth and the air shimmered with heat waves that danced like living spirits, there ruled a being whose heart burned with the purest flame of maternal love. The Witch of Izalith was not merely a sorceress or a queen, though she embodied both roles with grace that seemed to flow from the very essence of fire itself. She was something far more fundamental and precious, a mother whose love for her children and her people burned with an intensity that rivaled the Lord's soul she carried within her breast. Her domain was a realm of wonder that few who lived in the cooler regions of the world could properly imagine. Here, fire was not a destructive force to be feared and contained, but a nurturing presence that brought warmth to every hearth, light to every darkened corner, and comfort to every soul who called this burning paradise their home. The very architecture of Izalith seemed to grow organically from the living flame, with spires of crystallized fire reaching toward the sky and walls that glowed with their own inner light, casting no shadows because they were themselves the source of illumination. The witch herself was a figure of terrible beauty, her form wreathed in flames that never burned those she loved but danced around her like loyal pets eager for her attention. Her eyes held depths of fire that spoke of wisdom earned through ages of nurturing and protection, while her voice carried the crackling warmth of a hearth fire on a winter's night. She had mastered the art of flame not as a weapon of conquest, but as a tool of creation, using her power to forge not just objects of incredible beauty but entire ecosystems where fire-based life could flourish and thrive. Her daughters were the jewels of her crown, each one gifted with aspects of their mother's incredible power while maintaining their own unique personalities and abilities. They moved through the halls of Izalith like living flames given human form, their laughter echoing through corridors that rang like crystal bells when touched by the sound of joy. Some had inherited their mother's gift for creation, shaping flames into works of art that captured the very essence of beauty itself. Others had developed their own specializations, becoming masters of healing fire that could mend wounds and restore strength, or defensive flames that could shield the innocent from harm. Chief among these daughters was Quelana, whose mastery of pyromancy had elevated the art to heights that few could even comprehend, let alone achieve. She understood fire not just as an element to be controlled, but as a living force with its own will and desires, and her magic flowed from a partnership between human intent and elemental consciousness, rather than simple domination. Her flames were works of art in themselves, each spell a carefully crafted expression of beauty and purpose that left observers breathless with wonder. The witch's kingdom thrived under her benevolent rule, becoming a beacon of prosperity and culture that drew visitors from across the known world. Scholars came to study in libraries where books were written on pages of crystallized flame that would never fade or decay. Artists journeyed vast distances to learn techniques for working with fire as a medium, creating sculptures and paintings that literally glowed with inner light. Healers sought training in the therapeutic uses of controlled flame, learning to use warmth and light as medicines that could cure ailments that resisted all other forms of treatment. Yet beneath this surface of perfect harmony and endless prosperity, there stirred currents of unease that the witch was perhaps too loving and trusting to fully recognize. The first flame, that sacred source from which all their power and all their prosperity ultimately flowed, was not the eternal constant that everyone had assumed it would be. Like all things born of disparity, like all sources of change and growth, it was subject to the very law of entropy that it had brought into existence with its birth. The signs of this gradual decline were subtle at first, so minor that they could easily be attributed to natural fluctuation or temporary weakness that would surely correct itself given time. The flames that lit the great halls of Ainur Londo seemed perhaps a shade less brilliant than they had been in ages past. The warmth that flowed through the divine realm felt slightly less penetrating, requiring more effort to maintain the comfortable temperatures that the gods had grown accustomed to. The very air seemed to carry less of that electric energy that had characterized the early days of the Age of Fire. For Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, these changes were a source of growing anxiety that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness like a persistent whisper of doubt. He who had built his entire identity around the concept of eternal light, who had established his kingdom on the promise that the Age of Fire would last forever, found himself confronted with evidence that his greatest fears might be coming to pass. The flame was dying, and with it would die everything he had worked to create, everything he had sacrificed to achieve, everything he had told himself was justified by its eternal nature. But for the Witch of Izalith, the fading of the first flame represented something far more personal and immediate than political concerns or the abstract fate of kingdoms. She was a mother, and the thought of her children growing cold, of her people shivering in darkness, of her beautiful realm of fire slowly cooling into lifeless stone, was more than her loving heart could bear. Where Gwyn saw political catastrophe, she saw the faces of those she had sworn to protect, their trust in her ability to keep them safe and warm, challenged by forces beyond any individual's control. The solution, when it came to her, seemed so obvious and so natural that she wondered why none of the other lords had thought of it. If the first flame was fading, if its power was diminishing with each passing age, then surely the answer was not to simply accept this decline, but to act with the creative force that had always defined her approach to problems. She would birth a new flame, a successor to the first flame that would carry on its work of bringing light and warmth to the world. The logic was flawless, the intention pure, and the love that motivated it as genuine as any force that had ever moved the heart of a mother. The witch gathered her most talented daughters around her, sharing with them her vision of the great work they would undertake together. They would use their mastery of flame, their deep understanding of fire's essential nature, and their combined power to create something that had never existed before, a new source of light and warmth that would ensure their people's prosperity for ages uncounted. The preparations for this great working took years to complete. As the witch and her daughters researched every aspect of flame creation and studied the deepest mysteries of fire's fundamental nature, they consulted ancient texts that had been written during the early days of the Age of Fire, when the gods had first begun to understand their own power and the forces they had unleashed upon the world. They meditated in chambers where the walls themselves were made of living flame, seeking to commune directly with the elemental forces they hoped to birth anew. What they discovered in their research filled them with confidence and excitement. Fire, it seemed, was not merely a force of destruction, as some of the other lords believed, but a power of transformation and renewal that could theoretically be sustained indefinitely given the proper understanding and technique. The witch's own soul, infused with the essence of the first flame, contained within it the template for creating new sources of light and warmth that could theoretically surpass even the original in their purity and power. The ritual chamber they constructed for their great working was a marvel of both art and magical engineering, its every detail carefully designed to channel and focus the incredible energies they would be manipulating. The floor was inlaid with patterns of precious metals that had been heated and cooled in specific sequences to align them with the fundamental frequencies of flame itself. The walls were carved with symbols that seemed to move and shift in the flickering light, their meanings known only to the most advanced practitioners of fire magic. At the center of this chamber, the witch placed the focus for their working a specially prepared brazier that would serve as the womb from which their new flame would be born. This was not merely a container, but a carefully crafted instrument that had taken months to create, its every curve and angle calculated to provide the perfect environment for the delicate process of flame birth. The materials from which it was forged had been gathered from across the known world, each one chosen for its ability to resonate with specific aspects of fire's essential nature. When the appointed time arrived, the witch and her daughters took their positions around the brazier with the solemnity of priestesses approaching the most sacred of rituals. They had prepared for this moment through years of study and practice, and their confidence in their ability to succeed was absolute. They were, after all, the greatest masters of fire magic who had ever lived, beings whose understanding of flame surpassed even that of the gods themselves in its depth and sophistication. The ritual began with prayers and invocations that called upon the deepest sources of fire's power, words that had been carefully crafted to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. The witch's voice rose in ancient syllables that seemed to make the very air shimmer with potential, while her daughters added their own voices in harmony that grew more complex and beautiful with each passing moment. The chamber filled with sounds that were not quite music and not quite speech, but something that partook of both, an auditory expression of the forces they sought to birth. As the invocation reached its crescendo, the witch reached into the depths of her own soul, drawing upon the power of the Lord's soul of life that had made her what she was. The energy that flowed from her was unlike anything that had ever been channeled before, a raw, creative force that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of existence itself. Her daughters added their own power to the working, their individual flames merging with their mother's in a symphony of fire that grew brighter and more intense with each passing moment. For a brief, shining instant, it seemed as though their great work would succeed beyond their wildest hopes. The flame that began to kindle in the specially prepared brazier was unlike anything they had ever seen, not the golden radiance of the first flame nor the warm orange glow of their own magic, but something entirely new and different. This flame burned with colors that had no names, casting light that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond normal perception, radiating warmth that touched not just the body, but the very soul itself. But then, in a moment that would haunt the survivors for all their remaining days, something went terribly, catastrophically wrong. The flame they had birthed with such love and hope began to change, its beautiful colors shifting into hues that spoke not of creation, but of chaos, not of life, but of consumption. The gentle warmth it had radiated transformed into a searing heat that began to burn away not just physical matter, but the very essence of ordered existence itself. This was not the controlled fire they had mastered through years of study and practice, not the nurturing flame that had brought prosperity to their kingdom. This was something far more primal and dangerous, the chaos flame, a force of pure entropy that sought not to create or sustain, but to consume and transform everything it touched into more of itself. It was fire without purpose or direction, destruction without malice or intent, change so rapid and fundamental that it threatened to unweave the very fabric of reality itself. The witch realized the magnitude of what was happening in the space of a single, horrifying heartbeat. The flame she had created with such love was not a gift to her people, but a curse that would destroy everything she had ever worked to protect. With a mother's instinct to shield her children from harm, she threw herself directly into the path of the expanding chaos, using her own body as a barrier between the destructive force and her beloved daughters. The transformation that overtook her was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed, a process so alien and terrible that those who saw it struggled to comprehend what their eyes were showing them. The Witch of Izalith, whose beauty had been legendary throughout the known world, whose grace and wisdom had made her a figure of reverence and love, began to change in ways that violated every natural law that governed living beings. Her flesh, which had always been warm with the gentle heat of controlled flame, began to burn with the chaotic fire she had unleashed. But instead of being consumed and destroyed, her body seemed to absorb the destructive energy, taking it into itself in a desperate attempt to contain its spread. Her limbs elongated and twisted, becoming root-like appendages that spread across the chamber floor like the branches of some impossible tree. Her torso expanded and flattened, transforming into a mass of organic matter that pulsed with its own terrible life. Most horrible of all was what happened to her consciousness, her sense of self, the loving mother's heart that had motivated her great work. The chaos flame did not simply destroy these things, but fragmented them, scattering her identity across the growing mass of her transformed body like seeds scattered by a hurricane wind. She became the bed of chaos, a living nexus of destructive force that retained only scattered fragments of the woman she had once been. In moments of terrible clarity, she could still remember who she had been, could still feel the love for her children that had driven her to this sacrifice. But these memories came to her like echoes from a great distance, filtered through the alien sensations of her transformed existence. She was simultaneously herself and not herself, a mother protecting her children and the very force they needed protection from. Her daughters, watching in horror as their beloved mother sacrificed her very identity to contain the disaster she had unleashed, faced choices that no children should ever have to make. Some threw themselves into the spreading chaos, seeking to join their mother in whatever form of existence she now endured. Their transformations were less complete but no less tragic, their beautiful human forms becoming twisted amalgamations of flesh and flame that retained just enough of their original selves to be aware of what they had lost. Others made the agonizing decision to flee, to abandon their mother and their homeland, rather than succumb to the chaos that was consuming everything they had ever known. Chief among these was Quelana, whose mastery of pyromancy had ironically prepared her to understand the true magnitude of what was happening. She recognized that the chaos flame was not something that could be fought or contained through conventional means, and that staying to help would only result in her own transformation into something that could no longer help anyone. The escape from the dying kingdom of Izalith became a nightmare journey through a landscape that was transforming moment by moment into something alien and hostile. The beautiful halls where she had spent her childhood were filling with the offspring of chaos creatures that had once been people, animals, even inanimate objects, all transformed by exposure to the uncontrolled flame into beings that served no purpose beyond spreading the destruction further. These demons, as they would come to be known in later ages, were not evil in any intentional sense. They had no malicious agenda, no desire to cause suffering or spread fear. They were simply the products of change run wild, existence transformed beyond all recognition by exposure to forces that operated according to laws that predated and superseded the ordered universe that thinking beings could comprehend. Yet their very existence was a form of suffering that defied description. Many retained fragments of their original consciousness, enough awareness to understand what they had been and mourn what they had become. The demons that had once been the witch's daughters were perhaps the most tragic of all, for they remembered love and beauty and purpose, but could only express these memories through forms that had become incapable of creation, only destruction. The greatest of these transformed daughters became a creature of such power and tragedy that even other demons fled from her presence. The demon fire sage had retained more of her original consciousness than most, including her memories of the magical knowledge she had spent centuries accumulating. But this awareness only made her transformation more terrible, for she understood exactly what she had lost and what she had become. Her magic, once a thing of beauty that could heal wounds and warm hearts, had become a force of pure destruction that ignited everything she touched. Her voice, which had once sung lullabies to comfort frightened children, now produced only roars and shrieks that spoke of anguish beyond mortal comprehension. Her hands, which had once crafted flames of incredible delicacy and precision, could now only shape fire into weapons of war and instruments of chaos. In the deepest chambers of what had once been Izalith, other daughters met fates that were in some ways even more cruel. The spider demons that guarded the approaches to the bed of chaos had retained their sisterly bond with each other and their filial love for their transformed mother, but they could express these connections only through violence and territorial aggression. They fought any who approached not out of malice but out of a twisted form of protectiveness, their corrupted instincts telling them that driving away intruders was the only way to keep their family safe. The fair lady, perhaps the most tragic of all the transformed daughters, had become a creature whose very existence was an exercise in contradiction and sorrow. Her lower body had fused with the architecture of the ruined kingdom, making her literally part of the diseased landscape that Izalith had become. Yet her upper body retained enough of her original form to make her transformation all the more heartbreaking to witness. She had lost the ability to speak in any language that other beings could understand, her voice producing only sounds that seemed to blend pain and longing in equal measure. Yet she retained her memories of what language had been, what communication had meant, what it felt like to be understood and to understand others in return. Her attempts to reach out to the rare visitors who found their way to her chamber were exercises in futility that she nevertheless continued, driven by the hope that somehow, someday, someone would find a way to bridge the gulf that separated her transformed existence from the world of intelligible beings. Most cruel of all was her retention of her healing abilities, which had been corrupted by chaos into something that caused as much harm as it helped. She could still ease pain and mend wounds, but the process now infected those she touched with the same eggs of chaos that pulsed within her own transformed flesh. Her desire to help became a curse upon those she aided, spreading the very corruption she sought to heal. The demons that spread beyond the borders of the ruined kingdom carried with them not just destruction but a particular form of existential horror that infected everything they touched. Unlike the clean death that came from sword or flame, chaos corruption was a process that could take years or even decades to complete, during which the victim remained conscious and aware as their body and mind slowly transformed into something alien and incomprehensible. Communities that had existed in peace for generations found themselves gradually consumed by forces they could not understand or combat. The corruption spread through contact with infected individuals, through exposure to certain plants and animals that had themselves been touched by chaos, even through proximity to areas where demon blood had been spilled. Once it took hold in a region, it was almost impossible to eradicate completely, creating pockets of chaos throughout the world that would remain sources of danger for ages to come. Quelana, fleeing through this nightmare landscape with the few other survivors who had managed to escape the initial catastrophe, carried with her a burden of guilt that would define the rest of her extended existence. She had been one of the architects of the ritual that had created the Chaos Flame, had contributed her power and knowledge to the great working that had destroyed her family and her homeland. The fact that her intentions had been pure, that she had acted out of love and hope rather than malice or ambition, provided no comfort against the magnitude of the consequences her actions had helped to unleash. In the years that followed, as she wandered the world seeking some way to atone for her role in the catastrophe, Quelana would become the first teacher of pyromancy to those who had not been born with an innate connection to flame. Her decision to share the secrets of fire magic with ordinary humans was motivated not by generosity or a desire to spread her people's knowledge, but by a desperate hope that somewhere among her students might be someone with the skill and wisdom necessary to find a way to undo what she had helped to create. Each student she taught carried within them a fragment of her guilt and her hope. She passed on not just techniques for manipulating flame, but the responsibility to use that knowledge wisely, to avoid the mistakes that had led to the birth of chaos, to remember that the power to create also carried with it the power to destroy everything one held dear. Yet even as she taught others to wield the forces she had once mastered with such confidence, Quelana knew that the true solution to the disaster she had helped create lay not in human magic, but in divine intervention. Somewhere in the world, there would eventually arise a being with the power to venture into the heart of the chaos that had consumed her homeland, to face the bed of chaos that had once been her beloved mother, and to put an end to the suffering that had already lasted far too long. This knowledge brought her no peace, for she understood that such a solution would require not just incredible courage and skill, but the willingness to destroy what remained of her family in order to save the world from their continued existence. The hero who would eventually end the threat of chaos would have to kill her mother, her sisters, everything she had once loved, in order to prevent their suffering from spreading to consume all of creation. The true horror of the Witch of Izalith's fate lay not in the physical transformation she had undergone, terrible though that was, but in the way her greatest virtue had been turned against her, her love for her children, her desire to protect and provide for them, her willingness to sacrifice everything for their well-being. These had been the very qualities that had led her to attempt the creation of the Chaos Flame in the first place. Now, twisted by forces beyond her control or comprehension, that same love had become a source of endless suffering not just for herself, but for the very children she had sought to protect. The bed of chaos spawned demons with the same inexorable drive that had once made her a nurturing mother, but where she had once created life and beauty, she now gave birth only to destruction and corruption. Deep within the alien consciousness that the witch had become, fragments of her original self remained aware of what she was doing, understanding the consequences of each new demon birthed from her transformed flesh. She was simultaneously the protective mother desperately trying to shield her children from harm, and the source of the very danger they needed protection from, locked in an eternal cycle of creation and destruction that could only end with her own death. This was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire catastrophe, not that good intentions had led to terrible consequences, but that those same good intentions continued to operate even after they had been corrupted beyond all recognition. The witch's love for her children had not been destroyed by her transformation. but had been perverted into something that served chaos, while retaining just enough of its original nature to make the perversion a source of constant chaos, torment. In the deepest chambers of the ruined kingdom, where the bed of chaos pulsed with its alien life, visitors who possessed the courage or desperation to venture so far could sometimes hear sounds that seemed almost like weeping, not the simple grief of loss, but something far more complex and terrible. It was the sound of a mother's love transformed into an instrument of universal destruction, aware of what it had become but powerless to change or escape its nature. This was the true legacy of the Witch of Izalith's attempt to recreate the first flame, not just the birth of demons or the corruption of a kingdom, but the demonstration that even the purest intentions, when backed by power sufficient to reshape reality itself, could become sources of suffering that would endure for ages uncounted. The chaos flame burned on, fed by the very love that had brought it into existence, a testament to the terrible truth that in a world governed by disparity and entropy, even the most beautiful motives could give birth to consequences too horrible to contemplate. In the golden halls of Anor Londo, where the light of artificial suns cast eternal radiance through crystal windows and marble corridors that had been built to last until the end of time itself, there sat upon a throne of white stone a figure whose majesty had once inspired awe and devotion throughout the known world. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, first of the Lords, wielder of the mightiest lightning and architect of the Age of Fire, gazed out over his perfect kingdom with eyes that had begun to hold depths of shadow that no amount of divine radiance could fully dispel. The years had been kind to his realm in ways that mortal rulers could scarcely imagine. His kingdom stretched across vast territories where his subjects lived in prosperity and peace, their lives blessed by the warm light that flowed from his very presence. The great silver knights who served as his personal guard stood at their posts with the unwavering loyalty of beings who had found their perfect purpose, while throughout the realm, lesser knights and soldiers maintained order, with a discipline that spoke of genuine belief in the righteousness of their cause. Trade flowed along well-protected routes that connected every corner of his domain, bringing exotic goods and new ideas to markets that bustled with the activity of beings who had never known want or fear. Scholars filled libraries where the accumulated wisdom of ages was preserved in books that would endure for millennia, while artists created works of beauty that seemed to capture the very essence of divine inspiration in forms that mortal eyes could comprehend and appreciate. Yet beneath this surface of perfect harmony and endless prosperity, there stirred currents of unease that grew stronger with each passing season. The first flame, that sacred source from which all of Gwyn's power and all of his kingdom's glory ultimately flowed, continued its slow but inexorable decline. The signs were subtle still, visible only to those who possessed the wisdom to recognize them and the courage to acknowledge what they might portend. The great furnaces that provided warmth to the farthest reaches of his domain required more fuel to maintain their heat than they had in ages past. The magical lights that illuminated every street and building seemed to flicker occasionally, their radiance wavering for brief moments before returning to its normal intensity. Most telling of all was the change in Gwyn himself, a gradual dimming of the solar radiance that had once made him appear almost too bright for mortal eyes to look upon directly. What troubled the Lord of Sunlight far more than these physical manifestations of decline, however, was what he had begun to learn about the true nature of humanity and their relationship to the fire that sustained his realm. In the early days of the Age of Fire, humans had seemed like natural allies in the great work of building a civilization based upon light and order. They were industrious and adaptable, quick to learn and eager to serve. grateful recipients of the divine blessing that elevated their lives far above what they might have achieved through their own efforts alone. But as the centuries passed and Gwyn's understanding of the fundamental forces that governed existence deepened, he had made discoveries that filled him with a growing sense of dread. Humanity, it seemed, was not simply another race that had benefited from the coming of the Age of Fire. They were something far more significant and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The inheritors of the Dark Soul, carriers, within their very essence, of the power that represented the antithesis of everything he had worked to create. The Dark Soul, which the furtive pygmy had claimed from the first flame in those earliest days of disparity, was not merely another Lord's soul, like those wielded by the gods. It was something fundamentally different, a fragment of the original flame that had been touched by the primal darkness that existed before light, transformed by that contact into something that partook of both fire and shadow, in ways that defied easy understanding. Within every human being, no matter how humble their origins or limited their conscious understanding of their true nature, burned a tiny fragment of this dark soul. It was this inner flame of darkness that gave them their remarkable adaptability, their capacity for growth and change that far exceeded what their short lifespans should have allowed. But it was also this same dark essence that made them potentially the most dangerous threat that Gwyn's kingdom of light could ever face. For as the first flame continued its gradual decline, as the power that sustained the Age of Fire slowly diminished with each passing year, the dark soul fragments carried within humanity would naturally grow stronger. What had once been tiny sparks barely visible even to divine perception would eventually become blazing fires that could challenge the very foundations of the world order that Gwyn had established. The implications of this revelation were staggering in their scope and terrifying in their inevitability. Humanity was not simply a race that lived within Gwyn's kingdom. They were a ticking temporal weapon that would eventually explode into a force capable of overthrowing everything he had built. Their very existence was a countdown to the end of the Age of Fire, a biological clock that measured the remaining time before darkness would reclaim the world. Even worse was the growing evidence that some humans were already beginning to manifest the true power of their dark heritage. Reports reached the royal court of individuals who could manipulate shadows as easily as pyromancers controlled flame, who seemed to exist partially outside the normal flow of time, who possessed an understanding of forces that predated the Age of Fire itself. These were not random aberrations, but the first harbingers of what all humanity would eventually become if their development continued unchecked. Gwyn's response to this existential threat was swift and merciless. Though he clothed his actions in the language of divine necessity and benevolent protection, working in secret with his most trusted advisors and his most skilled practitioners of divine magic, he devised a solution that was as elegant as it was cruel, a curse that would bind the dark soul fragments within humanity, preventing them from ever developing their true potential, while simultaneously providing a mechanism for controlling human populations that might otherwise grow beyond manageable numbers. The Dark Sign was a masterpiece of divine artifice, a magical construct that appeared as a simple ring of fire branded into human flesh, but which functioned as both leash and collar for the dark power that dwelt within every member of their race. To most humans, the mark was invisible and intangible, affecting their lives in ways so subtle that they remained completely unaware of its existence. They lived and died believing themselves to be free agents, making their own choices, never realizing that their very capacity for choice had been fundamentally altered by divine intervention. The curse operated on multiple levels simultaneously, each one carefully designed to prevent humanity from ever realizing their true potential while maintaining the illusion of freedom that was necessary to keep them productive and cooperative. On the most basic level, It acted as a drain upon the dark soul fragments within human beings, constantly bleeding away small amounts of their dark power and redirecting that energy to feed the first flame itself. This process was so gradual and so subtle that no individual human ever noticed the loss, but collectively, it represented a significant source of fuel that helped to slow the flame's decline. More insidiously, the dark sign altered the very nature of human death, transforming what should have been a natural transition from life to whatever lay beyond into something far more complex and controllable. When humans bearing the curse died, their souls were automatically drawn to the first flame rather than following whatever natural path might have awaited them. This provided another source of fuel for the dying fire, while simultaneously preventing the accumulation of human souls in whatever realm the dead normally inhabited. But the most diabolical aspect of the curse revealed itself only when the first flame grew weak enough that its control over the dark sign began to falter. As the divine power that maintained the curse diminished, some humans began to manifest the condition that would become known as the undead curse, a state of existence that was neither truly living nor properly dead, but something caught between the two in ways that violated every natural law that governed mortality. These undead retained their memories and personalities, but found themselves unable to die permanently, their consciousness returning again and again to animate bodies that grew increasingly hollow with each resurrection. They retained their human appearance initially, but prolonged existence as undead inevitably led to a gradual loss of humanity that manifested as both physical degradation and mental deterioration. The brilliance of this system lay in its self-perpetuating nature. Undead were naturally driven by an insatiable hunger for the souls of others, a craving that could only be temporarily satisfied by killing and consuming the life force of other beings. This hunger made them dangerous to normal human populations, requiring their isolation and providing justification for the harsh measures that were taken to contain them. At the same time, the undead condition was clearly a disease that needed to be cured, a terrible fate that no compassionate society could ignore. This created a perfect pretext for the construction of way stations and asylums where the afflicted could be contained while supposedly receiving treatment for their condition. In reality, these facilities served as convenient collection points where undead could be gathered, studied, and eventually processed for whatever purpose the divine authorities deemed appropriate. The asylums themselves were monuments to the particular form of cruelty that could only be achieved through the combination of unlimited power and absolute certainty of one's own righteousness. Built in remote locations where the screams of their inmates could not disturb the peace of normal communities, these facilities were designed not for healing, but for the systematic breaking of human will and the harvesting of whatever remained of value in beings who had already lost almost everything that made existence meaningful. The undead who were brought to these asylums found themselves trapped in conditions that were carefully calculated to maximize despair while maintaining just enough hope to prevent complete mental collapse. They were provided with basic necessities for survival, but denied any form of comfort or meaningful activity that might make their existence bearable. They were kept in isolation from each other, preventing the formation of bonds or communities that might provide emotional support or opportunities for resistance. Most cruelly of all, they were subjected to treatments that promised eventual cure, while actually being designed to study the precise mechanisms through which the dark sign controlled human nature. Teams of divine researchers conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of what undead physiology could endure, gathering data about the relationship between humanity, the dark soul, and the curse that bound them together. The guards and administrators who staffed these facilities were not monsters in the conventional sense, but rather individuals who had been carefully selected for their ability to perform horrific acts while maintaining their belief in the righteousness of their cause. They genuinely believed that they were helping to solve the undead problem, that their work was necessary for the protection of normal human society, that the suffering they inflicted was justified by the greater good it served. This self-deception was made possible by the elaborate theological framework that Gwyn's court scholars had developed to explain and justify the undead curse. According to official doctrine, the curse was not a divine punishment, but a natural disease that afflicted humans who had been exposed to too much dark magic or who had committed sins that opened them to supernatural corruption. The fact that it seemed to strike randomly, affecting saints and sinners alike, was explained as evidence of the mysterious ways in which divine justice operated. The treatment provided in the asylums was described as both punishment for past transgressions and purification that would eventually restore the afflicted to normal human status. The harsh conditions were necessary to burn away the spiritual corruption that had caused their condition, while the isolation protected them from influences that might worsen their affliction. Every cruelty inflicted upon them was reframed as a mercy. Every indignity they suffered was presented as a step toward their eventual salvation. This framework of justification extended throughout Gwyn's entire approach to the human problem. The dark sign was not presented as a curse imposed by divine will, but as a natural consequence of humanity's flawed nature, a mark that identified those who had fallen prey to the dark influences that constantly sought to corrupt human souls. The fact that it eventually affected nearly all humans was evidence not of divine injustice, but of the fundamental weakness that made their race susceptible to spiritual corruption. The way stations that dotted the highways and trade routes of Gwyn's kingdom served a dual purpose that perfectly exemplified the double-edged nature of his rule. On the surface, they were charitable institutions that provided shelter and aid to travelers, evidence of the benevolent nature of divine governance, and the protection that the Lord of Sunlight extended to all his subjects. Pilgrims and merchants could find food and lodging at these facilities, while those who had lost their way could receive guidance and assistance from the faithful servants who staffed them. But beneath this veneer of charity lay their true function as processing centers for the identification and collection of undead. The staff at these facilities were trained to recognize the early signs of the curse, to identify individuals who had begun the transformation, but had not yet progressed far enough to be obviously afflicted. These subtle indicators, a certain hollowness around the eyes, a particular pallor to the skin, a quality of movement that suggested the beginning of physical deterioration, allowed the servants of the crown to identify and remove potential threats before they could spread their condition to others. Those who were identified as undead or potentially undead were treated with the same apparent kindness and concern that was shown to all travelers, but they were quietly separated from the general population and prepared for transport to the appropriate asylum. The process was conducted with such subtlety that most of those affected never realized they were being processed rather than helped, maintaining their trust in the system that was systematically removing them from society. The way stations also served as information gathering centers where reports about suspicious activities or individuals could be collected and forwarded to the appropriate authorities. Travelers were encouraged to report anyone they had encountered who displayed unusual abilities, who spoke of forbidden subjects, or who seemed to possess knowledge that might be connected to dark magic or other forms of corruption. This network of surveillance and control was so comprehensive and so subtly implemented that most of Gwyn's subjects remained completely unaware of its existence. They lived their lives believing themselves to be citizens of a free and prosperous kingdom, never realizing that every aspect of their existence was monitored and controlled by systems that had been specifically designed to prevent them from ever developing the power that was their natural birthright. The Silver Knights, who served as Gwyn's personal guard, represented perhaps the most tragic example of how the Lord of Sunlight's growing paranoia and desperation were transforming those who served him most faithfully. These warriors had once been among the finest examples of knightly virtue, individuals who had achieved a perfect balance between martial skill and moral purpose that made them living exemplars of everything the Age of Fire was supposed to represent. Their transformation from thinking beings into mindless automata was accomplished through a process that was presented as the highest honor that could be bestowed upon a faithful servant of the crown. The ritual of becoming a Silver Knight was described as a form of divine blessing that elevated the recipient beyond the limitations of mortal existence, granting them strength and endurance that far exceeded what any normal warrior could achieve. In reality, the process involved the systematic removal of everything that made the knights human, leaving behind only the perfect soldiers that Gwyn's growing paranoia demanded. Their capacity for independent thought was carefully excised, replaced by an absolute obedience that could never be questioned or compromised. Their ability to form emotional attachments was eliminated, ensuring that they could never be turned against their master through appeals to friendship or love. Most tragically of all, their memories of who they had once been were systematically erased and replaced with artificial recollections that served the needs of their divine master. They remembered being honored by their transformation, remembered choosing to undergo the process willingly, remembered feeling grateful for the privilege of serving in such an exalted capacity. These false memories were so perfectly crafted that the knights themselves believed them completely, never realizing that their gratitude was as artificial as every other aspect of their transformed existence. The Silver Knights stood at their posts throughout Anor Londo, with the unwavering dedication of beings who had found their perfect purpose, never questioning their orders or wondering about the world beyond their assigned duties. They were the ideal soldiers, incapable of fear or doubt, or any form of independent action that might interfere with their designated function. They represented everything that Gwyn wished he could make of all his subjects, beings whose entire existence was dedicated to serving his will without the complications introduced by free thought or personal desire. Yet even as he gazed upon these perfect servants, Gwyn understood that their very perfection was evidence of how far he had fallen from the ideals that had once motivated his rise to power. The knights he had created were no longer the noble warriors he had once been proud to call his companions, but rather hollow shells that bore only superficial resemblance to the beings they had once been. In creating the perfect guardians for his throne, he had destroyed the very things that had made them worthy of respect and admiration in the first place. This pattern of corruption through protection extended throughout every aspect of Gwyn's rule. The policies that were ostensibly designed to safeguard his kingdom and protect his subjects inevitably transformed both the protected and the protectors into shadows of what they had once been. The surveillance networks that were meant to identify threats ended up creating a society where trust became impossible, and paranoia was the only rational response to everyday interactions. The theological framework that was supposed to provide comfort and guidance to his subjects instead became a tool for controlling their thoughts and limiting their aspirations. The charitable institutions that demonstrated his benevolence actually served as mechanisms for removing anyone who might pose a challenge to his authority. Every mercy he showed concealed a cruelty. Every protection he offered came with chains attached. As the first flame continued its relentless decline and the measures necessary to maintain his kingdom became ever more extreme, Gwyn found himself faced with choices that would have been unthinkable in the early days of his reign. The king who had once ruled through inspiration and example increasingly governed through fear and manipulation, using the very love his subjects bore him as a weapon to ensure their compliance with policies they would have rejected if they had understood their true nature. The final stage of his transformation from benevolent ruler to desperate tyrant came with his decision to link himself directly to the first flame, to sacrifice not just his mortal existence, but his very identity, in order to provide the dying fire with fuel sufficient to sustain his kingdom for a few more centuries. This act, which would be remembered by future generations as the ultimate expression of noble self-sacrifice, was actually the culmination of a long process of moral decay that had begun with his first attempts to control the dark power within humanity. Gwyn's journey to the kiln of the first flame was not the heroic pilgrimage that court historians would later describe, but rather the desperate flight of a ruler who had finally been forced to confront the full consequences of his actions. Behind him lay a kingdom that had become a prison, subjects who had been transformed into slaves, and institutions that existed only to perpetuate systems of control that had long since lost any connection to the ideals they supposedly served. The linking of the fire was accomplished through a ritual that consumed not just Gwyn's physical form, but everything that had made him the person he had once been. His memories, his personality, his hopes and fears and dreams, all were fed into the hungry flames that needed fuel of the highest quality to continue burning. What remained after the linking was complete was not Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, but something that bore only superficial resemblance to the being he had once been. The Lord of Cinder, who rose from the ashes of the linking ritual, was a hollow shell animated by the first flame's need for a guardian, a puppet whose strings were pulled by forces beyond its own understanding or control. It retained enough of Gwyn's appearance to be recognizable, and enough of his power to be formidable, but the mind that directed these attributes was no longer capable of the complex thought and moral reasoning that had characterized its original incarnation. This hollow king would spend the remaining centuries of the Age of Fire standing guard over the source of its power, protecting the first flame from any who might seek to extinguish it, while simultaneously serving as a living battery that fed the fire with his own essence. He was both the ultimate protector of his kingdom's ideals and their complete negation, a being who had sacrificed everything that made life worth living in order to preserve a world that no longer deserved to exist. The prophecy that emerged in the wake of Gwyn's transformation was not a divine revelation, but a carefully crafted piece of propaganda designed to ensure that his sacrifice would not be unique. The chosen undead who would supposedly rekindle the flame was not a hero destined for glory, but rather the next victim in an endless cycle of exploitation that would perpetuate the systems of control that Gwyn had established. The undead curse, the asylums, the way stations, the surveillance networks, all of these would continue to operate exactly as Gwyn had designed them, processing an endless stream of potential fuel for a fire that could never be truly satisfied. Each linking of the flame would require a new sacrifice, a new hollow king to take the place of the previous one, ensuring that the cycle of exploitation would continue until the very concepts of choice and freedom had been forgotten by those who lived within its grip. This was the true horror of Gwyn's legacy. Not that he had become a monster, but that he had created a system that would continue to produce monsters long after he was gone. The kingdom he had built to protect light and order had become a machine for destroying everything that made light worth preserving and order worth maintaining. In his desperate attempt to prevent the Age of Darkness from arriving, he had created something far worse than darkness, an eternal twilight where hope was deliberately cultivated, only so that it could be harvested and consumed by powers that had long since forgotten what hope was supposed to achieve. Beyond the golden spires of Anorlondo, past the bustling markets and well-ordered streets where Gwyn's subjects lived their carefully regulated lives, there existed a place that had been deliberately forgotten by the architects of the Age of Fire. It was not forgotten because it was unimportant, but precisely because it was too important, too dangerous, too fundamentally threatening to the established order to be allowed to exist within the consciousness of those who might question why such a place had been created and what purpose it served. The painted world of Eriamis was a masterpiece of divine artifice, a pocket dimension that existed parallel to the physical realm, but remained accessible only through specific portals that had been hidden away in locations where they were unlikely to be discovered by casual exploration. It was a world complete unto itself, with its own landscapes and weather patterns, its own ecosystems and natural laws, its own terrible beauty that spoke of craftsmanship that surpassed even the magnificent architecture of Ainur Londo itself. Yet this world had not been created as a showcase for divine power or a paradise for the faithful. It had been designed and constructed for a single specific purpose that revealed the true depth of cruelty that lay beneath the benevolent facade of divine rule. The painted world was a prison, a place of exile, where those who were deemed too dangerous or too different to exist within normal society could be banished without the inconvenience of actually having to kill them. The creation of such a realm required not just immense power, but a particular form of moral blindness that could transform acts of profound cruelty into expressions of divine mercy. The gods who ordered its construction told themselves that they were being compassionate, that exile to a world where the undesirable could live freely among their own kind was far more humane than simple execution. They convinced themselves that the painted world was a gift rather than a punishment, a sanctuary rather than a prison, evidence of their enlightened approach to dealing with problems that less wise rulers might have solved through genocide. The artist who brought this vision into reality was known only as Ariamis, a being whose mastery of creative magic exceeded even the legendary skills of the gods themselves. His ability to craft not just objects or buildings, but entire worlds from the raw stuff of possibility made him invaluable to those who required his services. But it also marked him as someone who possessed knowledge and capabilities that made him potentially as dangerous as those he was commissioned to imprison. Ariamis approached his work with the dedication of a master craftsman, creating his greatest masterpiece, pouring into the painted world not just his technical skill, but his own understanding of beauty and harmony. He created landscapes that were breathtaking in their alien splendor, architecture that seemed to grow organically from the strange physics that governed his artificial realm, ecosystems where impossible creatures thrived in environments that could exist nowhere else. Yet, even as he worked to make the painted world as beautiful and livable as possible, Ariamis understood the true nature of what he was creating. Every detail he added, every wonder he crafted, every moment of beauty he built into the fabric of his artificial realm served to make the prison more bearable for its intended inhabitants, while simultaneously making their exile more complete and permanent. The more wonderful he made their prison, the less likely they would be to attempt escape, and the more justified their captors would feel in keeping them there. The first inhabitant of the painted world was also its most tragic, a being whose very existence represented a crime so fundamental that it challenged the basic assumptions upon which the Age of Fire had been built. Crossbreed Priscilla was the daughter of Seath the Scaleless, born from his obsessive experiments in the pursuit of immortality. But her mother's identity remained a mystery that spoke of violations too terrible to be openly acknowledged even by those who had commissioned them. Priscilla's crime was not anything she had done, for she had committed no acts of violence or rebellion, had spoken no words of sedition or challenge to divine authority. Her crime was simply existing as living proof that the rigid categories upon which the gods had built their understanding of the world were not as absolute as they claimed. She was neither fully dragon nor fully divine, but something new and unprecedented that partook of both natures while belonging fully to neither. Her very form challenged the theological frameworks that justified divine rule. If dragons and gods could interbreed, if new forms of existence could emerge from combinations that were supposed to be impossible, then what other assumptions about the natural order might prove to be equally false? Her white scales and graceful form were beautiful beyond description, but they represented a beauty that existed outside the approved categories of divine aesthetics, a loveliness that could not be contained within the systems of classification that maintained social order. More disturbing still was her temperament, which displayed none of the corruption or evil that the gods claimed was inevitable in beings who existed outside the proper boundaries of creation. Priscilla was gentle by nature, possessed of a wisdom and compassion that rivaled that of the most enlightened divine beings, completely lacking in the malice or ambition that might have provided justification for harsh treatment. She was, in every respect save her mixed heritage, exactly the kind of being that a just and merciful ruler would want as a subject. This fundamental decency made her infinitely more dangerous than any monster or demon, for her very existence proved that the categories used to justify oppression and exile were arbitrary constructs rather than natural laws. If a crossbreed could be wise and kind, if a being born outside the approved boundaries could display virtue that exceeded that of many who existed within them, then the entire system of classification that determined who deserved freedom and who merited imprisonment was revealed as nothing more than prejudice, disguised as natural law. The decision to exile Priscilla to the painted world was made not in anger or fear, but with the cold calculation of rulers who understood that some truths were too dangerous to be allowed to exist where they might inspire uncomfortable questions. She was not sent away because she was evil, but because she was good in ways that made the evil of her exile impossible to ignore. Her gentle nature made her a living accusation against those who condemned her, while her mixed heritage made her a symbol of possibilities that the established order could not tolerate. The exile itself was conducted with all the ceremony and dignity that the gods could muster, transformed through ritual and rhetoric into something that resembled an honor rather than a punishment. Priscilla was told that she was being sent to a realm where she could rule as queen over a kingdom perfectly suited to her unique nature, where she would be free from the prejudices and limitations that constrained life in the mortal world. The truth of her situation became apparent only after the portal closed behind her, and she found herself standing alone in a world that, however beautiful, was still fundamentally a cage. The landscapes that surrounded her were indeed magnificent. The architecture that rose from impossible geography was genuinely breathtaking, but none of it could change the fundamental reality that she had been separated from the world of her birth, not for any crime she had committed, but for the crime of challenging comfortable assumptions through her very existence. As the centuries passed and other exiles joined her in the painted world, Priscilla gradually came to understand the full scope of the system she had been caught within. Each new arrival brought their own story of persecution and exile, their own account of how difference had been transformed into danger through the application of divine logic that placed conformity above justice and social order above individual rights. The forlorn who populated the painted world were not monsters in any conventional sense, though their appearances might suggest otherwise to observers who had been trained to equate physical difference with moral corruption. They were beings who had been born with forms that deviated from approved norms, or who had been transformed by circumstances beyond their control, or who had simply asked questions that made their continued presence in normal society inconvenient for those in power. Some had been scholars whose research had led them to conclusions that challenged official doctrine about the nature of reality or the justifications for divine rule. Others had been artists whose work expressed ideas that were deemed subversive or dangerous to public order. Still others had simply been born into families or communities that were considered suspect, their exile serving as both punishment and warning to others who might be tempted to associate with undesirable elements. The crow demons, who served as guardians and guides within the painted world, exemplified the particular cruelty of a system that transformed victims into instruments of their own oppression. These beings had once been followers of Velka, the goddess of sin and punishment, who had sought to establish systems of justice that operated according to principles of fairness and proportionality rather than the arbitrary will of those in power. Their transformation into Corvian forms was not a curse in the traditional sense, but rather a punishment that had been crafted to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Their new bodies were powerful enough to serve as effective guardians for the painted world, ensuring that its inhabitants could not easily escape while protecting them from external threats that might seek to harm them. At the same time, their altered forms served as constant reminders of what happened to those who challenged the established order, visible warnings that even the most well-intentioned resistance to divine authority would ultimately be punished. Most cruelly of all, the crow demons retained their original personalities and memories, including their commitment to the ideals of justice and fairness that had originally motivated their service to Velka. They were forced to serve as prison guards in a system they recognized as fundamentally unjust, their own moral principles transformed into tools for maintaining the very oppression they had once sought to oppose. The psychological torture of this situation was exquisite in its precision. The crow demons could not abandon their posts without betraying their duty to protect the innocent inhabitants of the painted world, yet they could not fulfill their duties without participating in a system of exile and imprisonment that violated every principle they held sacred. They were trapped in a web of conflicting obligations that ensured their suffering, while making that suffering serve the needs of those who had created their torment. Velka herself remained a figure of mystery and contradiction within the pantheon of divine beings, her role as goddess of sin and punishment, placing her in an ambiguous position that made her potentially dangerous to the established order, while simultaneously making her indispensable to its functioning. Her domains included not just the punishment of wrongdoing, but the very definition of what constituted sin, the establishment of systems for determining guilt and innocence, and the administration of justice in cases where conventional authority proved inadequate. This made her both an ally and a potential threat to rulers like Gwyn, whose authority rested upon the assumption that divine will and moral law were identical. Velka's insistence that sin could be defined through objective principles rather than royal decree challenged the very foundations of absolute monarchy, while her commitment to proportional punishment conflicted with political necessities that sometimes required harsh treatment of minor offenses or lenient treatment of major crimes committed by valuable allies. The solution to this problem was characteristic of divine statecraft in its elegance and cruelty. Velka was neither destroyed nor openly opposed, but rather isolated and marginalized in ways that neutralized her potential for causing trouble while maintaining the appearance of respect for her divine status. Her followers were systematically transformed or exiled. Her temples were closed or converted to other purposes, and her teachings were reinterpreted in ways that made them serve the needs of the established order rather than challenging its assumptions. The crow demons were perhaps the most visible symbols of this process, living reminders of what happened to those who took Velka's teachings too seriously or applied them in ways that proved inconvenient to temporal authority. Their transformation served as both punishment for past disobedience and warning about the consequences of future resistance, while their continued service in the painted world provided ongoing proof that even the goddess of justice could not protect her followers from the reach of divine power, when that power was exercised with sufficient determination and ruthlessness. Among the most disturbing inhabitants of the painted world were the bone wheels, creatures whose very existence represented a form of suffering so alien and prolonged that it challenged basic assumptions about the nature of consciousness and the limits of endurance. These beings had once been human, but their exile to the painted world had been accompanied by transformations that went far beyond the merely physical alterations suffered by other inhabitants. The bone wheels were living manifestos of pain, their consciousness bound into forms that consisted of nothing but wheels of interlocked bones that rolled endlessly through the corridors and chambers of the painted world. They retained enough awareness to understand their condition and remember what they had once been, but they possessed no capacity for communication or meaningful interaction with other beings. They could only roll forward in endless motion, driven by compulsions they could not resist toward destinations they could not choose. Their creation represented the ultimate expression of a punishment philosophy that sought not just to remove troublesome individuals from society, but to transform them into living warnings about the consequences of resistance. The bone wheels served no practical purpose within the ecosystem of the painted world, provided no services that benefited other inhabitants, and posed no real threat to potential intruders. They existed solely as expressions of power, demonstrations of what could be done to those who pushed their opposition to divine authority beyond acceptable limits. The process by which humans were transformed into bone wheels was carefully designed to maximize psychological impact on those who witnessed it, while providing valuable information about the limits of human endurance under extreme conditions. The transformation was gradual, taking place over months or years, allowing the victim to experience every stage of their dissolution while remaining conscious enough to understand what was happening to them. This extended timeline served multiple purposes beyond simple cruelty. It provided researchers with opportunities to study the process by which consciousness adapts to increasingly alien forms of existence, generating valuable data about the relationship between physical form and mental identity. It also created opportunities for the victim to recant their previous positions, to beg for mercy, to provide information about other potential troublemakers who might be dealt with before their own resistance reached similarly dangerous levels. Most importantly, from the perspective of social control, the extended transformation process ensured that news of what was happening would spread throughout communities that might be harboring dissidents or potential rebels. The knowledge that resistance to divine authority could result in such a fate served as a deterrent far more effective than any conventional threat of death or imprisonment, since it promised not just ending but the transformation of ending into a form of eternal, purposeless motion that resembled a twisted parody of life itself. The bone wheels rolled through the painted world as living reminders of the price of pushing opposition too far, their endless motion serving as a mechanical metaphor for the futility of resistance against powers that operated according to logics that transcended normal human understanding. They were simultaneously the most pitiful and the most terrifying inhabitants of the realm, embodying in their tortured forms the ultimate consequences of challenging systems that possessed both the will and the capability to impose punishments that exceeded the bounds of conventional imagination. Jeremiah, the Xanthus king, represented a different category of exile altogether, a being whose transformation had been triggered not by political resistance or moral opposition, but by the simple act of witnessing truths that were too dangerous to be allowed to exist within normal consciousness. His story illustrated the particular paranoia that afflicted divine rulers when confronted with subjects who possessed the intellectual capacity to understand the true nature of the systems that governed their lives. Before his exile, Jeremiah had been a scholar and philosopher whose work focused on understanding the fundamental principles that governed reality itself. His research had led him to insights about the nature of the first flame, the relationship between light and dark, and the artificial nature of many of the categories that were used to justify social and political hierarchies. These discoveries were not themselves acts of rebellion, but they provided the foundation for questions that could have led to more direct challenges to established authority. The transformation that overtook Jeremiah was not imposed from outside, but rather emerged from within as his mind struggled to process information that conflicted with everything he had been taught to believe about the nature of reality. The revelation that the Age of Fire was not the natural order, but an artificial construct maintained through violence and deception, created cognitive dissonances that his psyche could not resolve through normal means. The madness that claimed him was not the simple insanity of a mind that had broken under stress, but rather a complex form of consciousness that existed partially outside normal reality. Jeremiah gained the ability to perceive and interact with layers of existence that remained hidden from ordinary awareness. But this expanded perception came at the cost of his ability to maintain coherent relationships with the physical world and its conventional inhabitants. His clothing, which became permanently yellow and gained properties that seemed to exist independently of normal physics, represented the visible manifestation of his transformation from ordinary scholar to something that partook of both human and divine nature without belonging fully to either category. The yellow robes marked him as someone who had moved beyond the reach of conventional authority, while simultaneously marking him as someone who could never again participate normally in the society he had once known. The chaos that followed Jeremiah wherever he went was not malicious in intent, but rather the inevitable consequence of his transformed state of being. His very presence destabilized the carefully maintained boundaries between different levels of reality, causing effects that appeared random and destructive to ordinary observers, but which actually followed patterns too complex for normal consciousness to comprehend. The decision to exile Jeremiah to the painted world was motivated not by anger at his discoveries, but by the pragmatic recognition that his continued presence in normal reality posed unacceptable risks to the systems of control that maintained social order. His madness was contagious in ways that conventional insanity was not, capable of inspiring similar transformations in others who possessed the intellectual capacity to follow the same logical pathways that had led to his own breakdown. More dangerous still was his potential influence on other scholars and philosophers who might be tempted to pursue similar lines of research if they believed that such inquiry could be conducted safely. Jeremiah's fate served as a warning about the dangers of pushing intellectual investigation beyond approved boundaries, while his exile ensured that his direct influence would be limited to those who had already been removed from normal society for their own acts of transgression or nonconformity. In the painted world, Jeremiah's chaotic influence created a zone of constant instability that made life difficult for other inhabitants, while providing valuable data for researchers who studied the effects of uncontrolled exposure to advanced metaphysical knowledge. His presence served as both punishment for his intellectual curiosity and ongoing experiment in the limits of consciousness under extreme conditions. The peaceful nature of Priscilla's rule over this realm of exiles stood in stark contrast to the violence and oppression that characterized the system responsible for its creation. Despite having every reason to harbor resentment against those who had condemned her to lifelong imprisonment, despite being surrounded by beings whose own experiences had given them ample cause for bitterness and rage, she chose to govern through compassion and understanding rather than revenge and cruelty. Her approach to leadership was based on the recognition that the inhabitants of the painted world had already suffered enough, that their exile from the ordinary world was punishment sufficient for whatever crimes they were alleged to have committed. She sought to create a community where difference was celebrated rather than feared, where the very qualities that had made her subjects unacceptable to normal society could be recognized as sources of strength and beauty. This gentle governance made Priscilla infinitely more dangerous to the established order than any conventional rebel or revolutionary leader could ever be. Her success in creating a peaceful, prosperous community from a population of supposed outcasts and criminals provided living proof that the categories used to justify oppression were arbitrary and false. If these allegedly dangerous beings could live together in harmony under enlightened leadership, what did that say about the necessity of the harsh measures used to control similar populations in the ordinary world? More troubling still was the example she provided of leadership based on compassion rather than fear, of authority exercised through moral example rather than threats of punishment. Her rule demonstrated that it was possible to maintain order and promote prosperity without resorting to the systems of surveillance and control that characterize divine governance, calling into question the very foundations upon which that governance claimed legitimacy. The fear that Priscilla inspired in the hearts of divine rulers was not fear of her power, though she was indeed formidable, but fear of her example. The painted world under her rule had become a rebuke to everything they claimed to represent, a demonstration that their methods were not just unnecessary, but actively counterproductive to the goals they claimed to pursue. Her very existence was an ongoing accusation that they were not the benevolent protectors they portrayed themselves as being, but rather tyrants whose authority rested on nothing more substantial than the willingness to inflict suffering on those who dared to question their right to rule. This made the painted world both sanctuary and threat, a place where the outcasts of society could find acceptance and peace, while simultaneously serving as a beacon of hope for others who suffered under systems of oppression that claimed to be necessary for social order. The knowledge that such a place existed, that alternatives to conventional authority were not just possible but successful, posed a challenge to established power that no amount of force could completely suppress. The isolation of the painted world was therefore both its greatest protection and its most significant limitation. The exiles within its borders were safe from further persecution, but they were also unable to share their experiences with those who remained trapped within systems of oppression that continued to claim their authority was both necessary and beneficial. The very success of their alternative community served to justify its continued isolation, since allowing its example to spread would threaten the stability of institutions that depended upon the belief that no alternatives existed. This created a perfect trap that exemplified the sophisticated nature of divine oppression. The outcasts were neither destroyed nor allowed to influence others, but rather preserved as living experiments in the consequences of rejecting established authority, while being prevented from demonstrating that such rejection could lead to better rather than worse outcomes. Their exile served simultaneously as punishment, warning, and ongoing research project, generating valuable information about human nature and social organization, while ensuring that this information remained restricted to those who already possessed the power to act upon it. The painted world thus represented both the heights of divine mercy and the depths of divine cruelty, a masterpiece of social engineering that transformed acts of compassion into instruments of control. The exiles within its borders were allowed to live and even thrive, but only on condition that their success remain hidden from those who might be inspired by their example. They were free to create their own society, but only within a prison whose walls were made not of stone or steel, but of dimensional barriers that ensured their isolation from the ordinary world. In this realm of beautiful exile, surrounded by others who had been cast out for the crime of being different, Priscilla ruled with a gentleness that made her simultaneously the most beloved leader in the known world and the most dangerous threat to established authority. Her very kindness was an act of rebellion. Her compassion, a form of revolution. Her successful creation of a peaceful community from a population of alleged criminals and outcasts, a demonstration that the systems of control used to govern ordinary society were not just unnecessary but actively harmful to the flourishing of those they claimed to protect. The painted world stood as testimony to the truth that exile from an unjust system was not punishment but liberation, that the company of fellow outcasts could be more nurturing than the approval of unjust authorities, and that the very qualities that made beings unacceptable to conventional society were often the same qualities that made them capable of creating something better than what they had been forced to leave behind. In the depths beneath the royal city of Ainur Londo, where the golden light of Gwyn's eternal sun had never penetrated, and where the shadows held secrets that predated even the age of fire itself, there lay hidden a realm that few among the living had ever seen, and fewer still had lived to describe. This was the domain of the primordial serpents, ancient beings whose wisdom stretched back to the very dawn of disparity, whose understanding of the forces that governed existence exceeded even that of the gods themselves. Yet it was not in these timeless depths that our tale of corruption and betrayal begins, but rather in the vibrant human settlement of New Londo, a city that had risen from humble beginnings to become one of the great success stories of human civilization during the Age of Fire, built upon a series of natural islands where three great rivers converged. New Londo represented everything that humanity could achieve when allowed to develop according to their own nature, rather than the careful plans and restrictions imposed by divine oversight. The city itself was a marvel of human engineering and artistry, its architecture reflecting not the imposing grandeur favored by the gods, but rather a more intimate beauty that spoke to the human scale of experience and desire. Buildings rose in organic clusters around courtyards and plazas where citizens gathered to conduct business, share news, and celebrate the festivals that marked the turning of seasons and the passage of years. The waterways that surrounded and flowed through New Londo were not merely practical necessities, but integral elements of the city's character and culture. Bridges of elegant stone and carved wood connected the various districts, their surfaces worn smooth by countless footsteps of citizens going about their daily lives. Markets flourished along the waterfront, where goods from distant lands arrived on ships whose sails bore the marks of adventures and trading expeditions that spanned the known world. What made New Londo truly remarkable, however, was not its physical beauty or commercial prosperity, but rather the nature of its governance. Unlike the divine kingdoms where authority flowed downward from godlike rulers to subjects who were expected to accept whatever decisions were made on their behalf, New Londo had developed systems of leadership that emerged organically from the community itself and remained accountable to those they served. The four kings who ruled the city had not claimed their positions through divine appointment or inherited right, but had risen to leadership through a combination of wisdom, competence, and the genuine trust of their fellow citizens. Each had distinguished himself in different aspects of civic life. One as a scholar whose understanding of law and justice helped resolve disputes that might otherwise have torn the community apart. Another as a trader whose connections throughout the known world brought prosperity to all citizens. A third as a warrior whose courage in defending the city had saved countless lives, and the fourth as a healer whose skills had preserved the health and well-being of the population during times of plague and disaster. Their rule was marked by a remarkable degree of cooperation and consultation, with major decisions emerging from deliberations that included not just the kings themselves but representatives from every district and guild within the city. This participatory approach to governance created a sense of shared ownership in civic institutions that was unknown in the divine kingdoms, where subjects were expected to accept whatever policies their immortal rulers deemed appropriate without question or input. The prosperity that resulted from this enlightened form of leadership attracted attention throughout the known world, drawing visitors who came not just to trade or seek employment, but to study the methods by which New Londo had achieved such remarkable success. Scholars arrived from distant kingdoms to document the city's governmental innovations, while craftsmen came to learn techniques that had been developed through the free exchange of ideas rather than the hoarding of knowledge that characterized divine institutions. More significantly, New Londo began to attract refugees from other lands where human populations lived under more restrictive conditions. These newcomers brought with them stories of oppression and control that highlighted the contrast between the freedom enjoyed in New Londo and the limitations imposed elsewhere. The city became a beacon of hope for humans throughout the world, proof that their race was capable of greatness when allowed to develop without excessive interference from divine authority. This growing reputation for freedom and prosperity inevitably attracted attention from sources that viewed human independence with suspicion and alarm. The very success of New Londo posed an implicit challenge to the theological frameworks that justified divine rule over human populations, suggesting that the restrictions and controls imposed elsewhere were not necessary for maintaining order and promoting well-being, but were rather tools for perpetuating systems of dominance that served the interests of rulers rather than the ruled. The arrival of Darkstalker Carthy in New Londo marked the beginning of the end for the city's golden age. Though the serpent's initial approach was so subtle and seemingly beneficial that even the wisest of the four kings failed to recognize the true nature of the threat he represented, Carthy did not arrive with armies or demands for submission, nor did he present himself as an enemy of human freedom or prosperity. Instead, he came as a teacher and advisor, offering knowledge that promised to elevate New Londo's already impressive achievements to even greater heights. The primordial serpents were beings whose very existence challenged the categories through which most creatures understood reality. They were ancient beyond measure, their consciousness stretching back to times before the first flame had brought disparity into the world. Yet they remained vitally engaged with the ongoing development of events in ways that suggested purposes and agendas that operated on scales too vast for ordinary minds to comprehend. Carthy's knowledge was genuine, and his gifts were real, but the context in which he offered them was carefully concealed from those who received his instruction. He spoke to the four kings of humanity's true nature and potential, revealing to them secrets about the dark soul that had been hidden by divine authorities, who feared what humans might accomplish if they understood their real capabilities. The revelations that Carthy shared were simultaneously liberating and terrifying in their implications. Humanity, he explained, was not the young and fragile race that divine propaganda portrayed them as being, dependent upon godly protection and guidance for their survival and development. They were instead the inheritors of one of the original Lord Souls, carriers of power that was potentially equal to that wielded by the gods themselves, beings whose apparent weakness was actually the result of systematic oppression designed to prevent them from achieving their true potential. This knowledge provided explanations for observations that the four kings had made throughout their lives but had never been able to fully understand. It explained why humans seemed to possess such remarkable adaptability, why they could thrive in environments and circumstances that would destroy other races, why they displayed such extraordinary creativity and resilience when faced with challenges that should have overwhelmed them. More importantly, it explained the nature of the restrictions and controls that divine authorities imposed upon human populations. These were not protective measures designed to shield humanity from dangers they were too weak to face on their own, but rather suppressive techniques intended to prevent them from developing the powers that were their natural birthright. The undead curse, the surveillance networks, the systematic limitation of human knowledge and capability, all were revealed as elements of a comprehensive strategy designed to keep humanity in a state of permanent subjugation. The truth that Cather revealed was both empowering and enraging, providing the four kings with understanding that allowed them to see their world with unprecedented clarity, while simultaneously filling them with righteous anger at the deceptions that had been practiced upon their entire race. The knowledge that humanity possessed the potential for godlike power was intoxicating, but the revelation that this power had been systematically denied to them for centuries was infuriating in ways that threatened to overwhelm their capacity for rational thought. Cathy's teaching methods were perfectly calculated to maximize both the appeal of his revelations and the emotional impact of the truths he shared. He did not simply present information, but guided his students through processes of discovery that allowed them to reach conclusions on their own, making the knowledge feel like personal insights rather than external instruction. This approach made his teachings more convincing while simultaneously creating a sense of intellectual ownership that made questioning or rejecting his guidance seem like a form of self-betrayal. The serpent also demonstrated remarkable skill in timing his revelations to coincide with events that would make them seem more credible and urgent. When divine authorities imposed new restrictions on human activities, or when reports arrived of harsh treatment of human populations in other kingdoms, Caith would provide context that explained these developments as evidence of growing divine fear about humanity's potential awakening to their true nature. This pattern of revelation and confirmation created a psychological dynamic that made resistance to Cathy's influence increasingly difficult as time progressed. Each new piece of evidence that supported his claims made his overall narrative more believable, while each new insight into the nature of human oppression made his proposed solutions seem more necessary and justified. The transformation of the four kings from benevolent rulers into something far more dangerous was not accomplished through direct corruption or magical influence, but rather through the gradual alteration of their understanding and priorities. As they learned more about humanity's true nature and the systematic oppression that had been practiced against their race, their focus shifted from serving their immediate community to advancing what they perceived as the larger cause of human liberation. This shift in perspective, subtle at first but increasingly pronounced as Cathy's instruction continued, fundamentally altered the nature of their governance. Policies that had once been designed to promote the well-being of New Londo's citizens were gradually restructured to serve the broader goal of preparing humanity for the eventual confrontation with divine authority that Cathy presented as inevitable and necessary. The changes were implemented so gradually and were justified with such compelling rhetoric that most citizens initially welcomed them as evidence of their leaders' growing wisdom and foresight. New systems for identifying and developing human potential were presented as educational reforms that would help every citizen achieve their full capabilities. Military preparations were explained as necessary precautions against the increasing hostility that human independence was generating among divine authorities. Most significantly, the four kings began to implement programs designed to awaken the dark power that Caith taught them was the birthright of every human being. These initiatives were presented as spiritual development practices that would help citizens achieve greater self-understanding and personal fulfillment, but their true purpose was to gradually increase the amount of active dark energy within the human population of New Londo. The process by which ordinary humans were encouraged to explore and develop their connection to the dark soul was carefully designed to minimize initial resistance while maximizing long-term transformation. Citizens were invited to participate in meditation and self-exploration practices that were presented as traditional forms of spiritual development, but which actually served to weaken the barriers that normally prevented direct access to the dark power within them. These practices were genuinely beneficial in many ways, providing participants with increased self-awareness, emotional resilience, and mental clarity that improved their ability to deal with the challenges of daily life. The positive effects served to validate the program while masking the more subtle changes that were occurring in participants' fundamental relationship with the forces that governed their existence. As more citizens became involved in these development programs, and as their connection to dark power grew stronger, the character of New Londo began to change in ways that were initially almost imperceptible. The city had always been prosperous, but prosperity began to take on new meanings as citizens discovered they could accomplish tasks and overcome obstacles that had previously seemed impossible. The enhanced capabilities that resulted from awakened dark power were intoxicating in their scope and immediacy. Citizens who had struggled with physical limitations found themselves possessed of strength and endurance that exceeded anything they had previously imagined possible. Those who had felt constrained by intellectual boundaries discovered that their minds could process information and solve problems at levels that approached divine capability. Most seductive of all was the sense of connection and unity that developed among those who had undergone the awakening process. The dark power that flowed within them created bonds of understanding and empathy that transcended ordinary human relationships, allowing for forms of communication and cooperation that seemed to approach telepathic intimacy. These enhanced relationships created a sense of community and shared purpose that was unprecedented in human experience. Citizens who had once competed for resources and recognition now worked together with an efficiency and dedication that made their collective achievements seem almost supernatural. The city's prosperity increased dramatically as human potential was unleashed from the constraints that had previously limited its expression. Yet beneath this surface of remarkable achievement and enhanced capability, darker changes were taking place that would ultimately transform New Londo from a beacon of human potential into something that represented humanity's capacity for horror as much as its capacity for greatness. The dark power that provided such remarkable benefits was not simply a neutral energy source that could be used according to the conscious intentions of those who wielded it. The dark soul fragments that existed within every human being were connected to forces and influences that predated not just human civilization, but the very concepts of civilization and morality that gave meaning to human existence. As these fragments were awakened and strengthened, they brought with them influences that operated according to logics that were fundamentally alien to the values and purposes that had guided human society since its inception. The Four Kings were the first to experience the full consequences of prolonged exposure to awakened dark power, and their transformation provided a preview of what would eventually overtake the entire population of their city. The change was not dramatic or sudden, but rather a gradual alteration in their priorities and methods that initially seemed like nothing more than increased dedication to their responsibilities as leaders. Their concern for the well-being of their immediate subjects gradually expanded into an abstract commitment to the advancement of humanity as a whole, a shift that seemed noble and enlightened, but which actually represented the beginning of their disconnection from the specific relationships and obligations that had once defined their moral universe. The citizens of New Londo became less important as individuals and more significant as representatives of human potential, resources to be developed and deployed in service of larger goals that transcended local concerns. This abstraction of their moral focus was accompanied by changes in their understanding of what constituted acceptable methods for achieving their objectives. Actions that would once have been unthinkable because of their impact on specific individuals could now be justified as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of humanity as a whole. The hunger that gradually developed within the four kings was not initially recognized as such, because it began as what seemed like an admirable dedication to their work and responsibilities. They found themselves staying awake for longer periods, working with greater intensity, pursuing their goals with a focus that seemed to demonstrate exceptional commitment to public service. But as time progressed, it became clear that what drove them was not mere dedication, but a form of compulsion that operated independently of their conscious will or rational judgment. They needed to act, to achieve, to acquire, to expand their influence and capabilities in ways that provided only temporary satisfaction, before demanding even greater efforts and achievements. Most disturbing of all was the way this hunger began to focus, specifically on humanity itself. The dark power that flowed within the four kings created a craving for the life force of other human beings, a need that could be temporarily satisfied by draining the essence from their subjects, but which inevitably returned with even greater intensity. This transformation from protectors into predators was accomplished through subtle stages that allowed the kings to rationalize each step as necessary and justified. Citizens who volunteered for advanced spiritual development programs were told that they would be contributing their energy to projects that would benefit all of humanity, that their individual sacrifice would be repaid many times over by the collective advancement that their contribution would make possible. The volunteers were not killed in any conventional sense, but rather drained of their humanity in ways that left them alive but fundamentally altered. They retained their memories and personalities, but lost something essential that had once defined them as human beings, becoming hollow shells that could function normally in most circumstances, but which lacked the spark of autonomous will that separated true individuals from sophisticated automata. These hollowed citizens provided temporary relief from the king's growing hunger, while simultaneously serving as examples of what could be accomplished through the proper application of dark power. They were presented to the general population as individuals who had achieved a higher form of existence, beings who had transcended the limitations and vulnerabilities that constrained ordinary human experience. The appeal of this apparent transcendence was enormous, particularly for citizens who had watched friends and family members undergo the transformation and seemingly benefit from it. The hollowed displayed enhanced physical and mental capabilities, seemed immune to many of the fears and anxieties that plagued normal human existence, and demonstrated a serenity and focus that appeared to represent the highest form of spiritual development. What was not immediately apparent to observers was that these enhanced capabilities came at the cost of everything that made existence meaningful or valuable. The hollowed retained their memories but lost their capacity to form new emotional connections. They could perform complex tasks but no longer experience satisfaction from their accomplishments. They appeared serene because they had lost the ability to care about anything deeply enough to be disturbed by it. This gradual transformation of New Londo's population from a community of free individuals into a collection of hollowed servants served multiple purposes within Carthy's larger agenda. It provided the four kings with the human essence they needed to maintain their enhanced capabilities while simultaneously creating a population that was perfectly suited for the role he envisioned humanity playing in his plans for reshaping the world order. The Dark Wraiths who emerged from this process represented the ultimate expression of human potential when guided by the primordial serpent's vision. These were beings who had fully embraced their connection to dark power, who had allowed their original personalities to be subsumed into something larger and more terrible than individual human consciousness could normally contain. The Dark Wraiths retained their human intelligence and capability, but no longer operated according to human values or limitations. They could move through shadow and flame with equal ease, could drain the life from other beings with a touch, could manipulate the fundamental forces of existence in ways that made them formidable opponents for even divine adversaries. Yet their power came at a cost that was evident to anyone who observed them closely. They had gained capabilities that exceeded those of the gods themselves, but they had lost everything that had once made them recognizably human. They were simultaneously the highest achievement of human potential and its complete negation, beings who demonstrated what humanity could become while serving as warnings about the price that such transformation demanded. The covenant that bound the Dark Wraiths to Kaith was not simply a political alliance but a fundamental alteration in the nature of their existence. They had surrendered their individual autonomy in exchange for power and purpose that transcended personal desires or concerns, becoming instruments of the Serpent's will, while believing themselves to be agents of human liberation. This surrender was accomplished not through coercion or magical compulsion, but through the gradual erosion of the boundaries between individual identity and collective purpose. As the Dark Wraiths developed their abilities and advanced in their service to Kaith's agenda, they found their personal desires and concerns becoming increasingly irrelevant compared to the larger mission they were part of. The process was seductive because it provided genuine relief from the anxieties and limitations that plagued individual existence, while offering participation in something that felt infinitely more significant and meaningful than personal achievement or happiness. The Dark Wraiths experienced a form of transcendence that was real and transformative, but which ultimately served to make them more effective tools for purposes they no longer possessed the independence to question or resist. The tragedy of New Londo's fall lay not in the external destruction that would eventually overtake the city, but in the internal transformation that had preceded and necessitated that destruction. By the time the sealers of New Londo recognized the true nature of what was happening within the city's boundaries, the corruption had progressed too far to be reversed through any means short of complete annihilation of everything that New Londo had become. The decision to flood the city was made not by enemies seeking to destroy human achievement, but by allies who understood that the community they had once admired no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The citizens who would be killed by the rushing waters were no longer the free and prosperous human beings who had once made New Londo a beacon of hope, but rather hollowed shells animated by dark power and directed by purposes that represented everything human civilization should oppose. Ingwood and his fellow sealers approached their terrible duty with full awareness of what they were destroying along with what they hoped to save. The flooding of New Londo would eliminate not just the corrupted beings that its citizens had become, but also the architecture, art, and accumulated culture of generations of human achievement that had once inspired admiration throughout the known world. Yet the alternative to this drastic action was even more horrific to contemplate. The corruption that had claimed New Londo was not contained within the city's boundaries, but was actively spreading through the Dark Wraith's activities and the influence that Kaith had continued to exert on human populations throughout the world. Allowing it to continue would have meant watching all of human civilization gradually transform into something that retained humanity's capabilities, while abandoning everything that made humanity worth preserving. The waters that rushed through New Londo's streets carried with them the dreams and aspirations of countless human beings who had believed they were building something beautiful and lasting. Libraries filled with the accumulated wisdom of generations were swept away, along with workshops where craftsmen had perfected techniques that would now be lost forever. Markets that had brought together traders from across the known world disappeared beneath waves that erased centuries of commercial and cultural development. Most tragic of all were the citizens themselves, those who had retained enough of their original humanity to understand what was happening to them as the waters rose around them. They experienced the flood not as a natural disaster, but as a form of execution, a final judgment that declared them too dangerous to be allowed to exist, despite their own incomplete understanding of what they had become. The ghosts that remained in the flooded ruins of New Londo served as permanent reminders of the price that had been paid to prevent Carthy's vision from spreading further. These were not the evil spirits that most assumed them to be, but rather the lingering consciousness of beings who had been caught between human and post-human existence when the waters claimed them. Their continued existence in the flooded city was a form of purgatory that perfectly reflected the moral ambiguity of their situation. They had participated in their own corruption, had welcomed the transformation that had ultimately necessitated their destruction, yet they had done so while believing they were advancing human potential and freedom rather than serving an agenda that would have enslaved their entire species. The abyss that remained in the deepest parts of the flooded city was not simply a geographical feature, but a metaphysical wound in reality itself, a place where Cathy's influence had grown so strong that the normal laws governing existence no longer applied. This was what New Londo would have become if the corruption had been allowed to continue, a realm where human consciousness had been so thoroughly transformed that it no longer bore any meaningful resemblance to the species that had created it. In the end, New Londo's destruction served as both warning and proof of concept, demonstrating the seductive power of the path that Cathy offered, while illustrating the ultimate destination toward which that path led. The city had achieved everything that human civilization aspired to achieve, had transcended every limitation that divine authority had imposed upon human development, and had gained power that rivaled that of the gods themselves. Yet in achieving these goals, New Londo had lost everything that made achievement meaningful or power worth possessing. The lesson of its rise and fall was that some victories were indistinguishable from defeat, that some forms of transcendence were actually forms of annihilation, and that the price of unlimited power was the surrender of everything that made power worth having. In the northern reaches of Anor Londo, where the golden light of Gwyn's artificial sun grew dim and cold shadows gathered in chambers that had once blazed with the warmth of divine authority, there sat upon a throne of moonlight and silver a figure whose very existence represented one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the Age of Fire. Gwyndolin, the Dark Sun, was both prince and princess, both divine heir and living contradiction, both beloved child and shameful secret, whose presence in the halls of power served as a constant reminder of truths that the established order could neither acknowledge nor eliminate. The circumstances of Gwyndolin's birth had violated every assumption about the nature of divine reproduction and the categories that governed the relationship between light and darkness, male and female, acceptable and unacceptable forms of existence. Born to Lord Gwyn during the height of his power, when the first flame burned brightest, and the Age of Fire seemed destined to endure forever, this child emerged into the world bearing characteristics that challenged the very foundations upon which divine authority claimed legitimacy. Where other children of the gods displayed clear associations with the forces of light and fire that defined their divine heritage, Gwyndolin manifested an affinity for moon and shadow that seemed to emerge from sources that predated the Age of Fire itself. This connection to lunar power was not merely an unusual magical specialization, but something that suggested fundamental questions about the nature of divine bloodlines and the stability of the categories used to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate forms of consciousness. Even more disturbing to those who witnessed the child's early development was the fluidity of gender identity that seemed to be an intrinsic part of Gwyndolин's nature. This was not the simple ambiguity that occasionally appeared in mortal beings and could be resolved through social convention or parental decree, but rather something that suggested a form of existence that transcended the binary classifications upon which both divine theology and social organization depended. The response to these unsettling characteristics was swift and comprehensive, though it was accomplished through methods that maintained the appearance of loving parental concern while serving the deeper purpose of protecting the royal family from the political consequences of having produced an heir whose very existence raised uncomfortable questions. Gwyndolin was raised as a daughter rather than a son, a decision that was presented as accommodation to the child's apparent preferences, but which actually served to remove potential challenges to succession while providing a framework for understanding divine nature that did not require fundamental revision of existing theological principles. The magic that Gwyndolin mastered under this carefully constructed identity was unlike anything practiced by other members of the divine pantheon, drawing upon lunar forces that operated according to principles that seemed to invert or subvert the solar power that had become the defining characteristic of legitimate divine authority. Where traditional divine magic sought to illuminate and reveal, Gwyndolin's abilities created illusions and concealment that could transform reality itself into something more palatable than truth. This mastery of illusion was not simply a magical technique, but a fundamental approach to existence that allowed Gwyndolin to function within a social system that would have rejected or destroyed a more straightforward expression of the contradictions that define the young deity's nature. Through carefully crafted deceptions, Gwyndolin could appear to conform to expectations while maintaining enough authentic selfhood to avoid complete psychological dissolution. The irony of this situation was exquisite in its implications. The divine order that claimed to represent truth and enlightenment, that justified its authority through appeals to clarity and divine wisdom, had produced an heir whose greatest talents lay in the creation and maintenance of beautiful lies that made reality more bearable for those who could not accept its actual nature. As Gwyndolin matured and began to assume responsibilities within the divine hierarchy, these talents for deception and illusion proved to be not handicaps that needed to be overcome, but rather invaluable assets that served the deeper needs of a kingdom increasingly dependent upon the maintenance of comfortable falsehoods. The Age of Fire was not the eternal paradise that its subjects believed it to be, and the growing awareness of this fact among the divine ruling class created a pressing need for someone capable of managing the gap between appearance and reality. The First Flame's gradual decline had created problems that extended far beyond the technical challenges of maintaining adequate power for the kingdom's magical infrastructure. As the sacred fire grew weaker, the illusions that maintained social stability became increasingly difficult to sustain through conventional means. Citizens who had lived their entire lives believing in the permanence and righteousness of divine rule were beginning to notice inconsistencies and contradictions that suggested all was not as perfect as they had been taught to believe. Gwyndolин's unique capabilities provided solutions to these problems that conventional divine magic could not achieve, while other gods struggled to maintain their authority through increasingly desperate applications of force and intimidation. Gwyndolin could simply alter the perceptions of troublesome subjects, making them see and believe whatever was necessary to maintain social stability and political order. This power to reshape reality through the manipulation of perception was simultaneously the most gentle and the most totalitarian form of control ever devised by divine intelligence. Unlike conventional tyranny, which depended upon the threat of punishment to maintain compliance, Gwyndolин's illusions made resistance impossible by ensuring that subjects never became aware of anything that might inspire rebellious thoughts or actions. Citizens who lived under the influence of these divine deceptions experienced a form of existence that was perfectly comfortable and satisfying, while being completely divorced from any authentic understanding of their situation. They saw prosperity where economic systems were failing, perceived justice where arbitrary power was exercised without accountability, felt protected where they were actually being systematically exploited for purposes they were not allowed to comprehend. The tragedy of this system lay not in the suffering it inflicted, for its subjects experienced very little direct pain or obvious hardship, but rather in the way it transformed the very concepts of choice and agency into meaningless abstractions. Citizens who believed themselves to be free agents making informed decisions about their lives were actually responding to stimuli that had been carefully crafted to produce predetermined outcomes. This manipulation was accomplished with such subtlety and skill that even those who administered it sometimes lost track of the boundaries between authentic reality and the carefully constructed alternatives that Gwendolyn's magic had made possible. The line between protecting subjects from uncomfortable truths and protecting power structures from accountability became increasingly blurred as the illusions grew more comprehensive and sophisticated. The most elaborate and significant of these deceptions was the figure that came to be known throughout the kingdom as Guinevere, Princess of Sunlight, whose radiant beauty and maternal benevolence served as visible proof of the divine family's continued commitment to their subjects' well-being. This goddess appeared before visitors to Anor Londo as a being of such perfection and grace that her very presence seemed to validate every claim about divine superiority and beneficent rule. The crowds that gathered to witness Guinevere's appearances experienced genuine rapture in her presence, feeling themselves blessed by contact with divinity in its purest and most accessible form. Her voice carried compassion that seemed to flow directly from the source of all maternal love, while her form radiated health and vitality that promised eternal protection and prosperity for those faithful enough to deserve her favor. Yet this beloved figure, whose image adorned temples throughout the kingdom, and whose name was invoked in prayers that rose from millions of grateful hearts, existed nowhere outside the complex illusions that Gwendolyn had crafted to fill the absence left by divine family members, who had long since abandoned their responsibilities to their subjects. The real Guinevere had departed Anor Londo years earlier, fleeing the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of a court that had grown paranoid and desperate as the first flame's decline became undeniable. Her departure had left a void in the public consciousness that threatened to destabilize the entire system of belief upon which divine authority depended. Citizens who had grown accustomed to periodic reassurance from their beloved princess began to ask uncomfortable questions about her absence, while enemies of the divine order saw opportunity in the growing awareness that all was not as perfect in the golden halls of power as official propaganda claimed. Gwendolyn's solution to this crisis was masterful in its conception and flawless in its execution. Rather than attempting to explain the real Guinevere's absence or find an adequate replacement, the young deity simply created an illusion so perfect and comprehensive that it became functionally indistinguishable from reality for all practical purposes. The illusory Guinevere possessed all the characteristics that citizens expected their beloved princess to display, along with enhanced attributes that made her even more inspiring and reassuring than the original had ever been. She was infinitely patient with supplicants who sought her aid, unfailingly wise in her counsel to those who faced difficult decisions, and absolutely consistent in her message of hope and divine protection for all who remained faithful to the established order. This artificial goddess became the public face of divine rule during its most precarious period, providing the stability and reassurance that prevented social collapse while the real power structure adapted to the challenging realities of governing during a period of declining resources and increasing external pressures. Her presence allowed other members of the divine hierarchy to work behind the scenes without having to maintain the exhausting public appearances that had once been essential parts of their responsibilities. The creation and maintenance of such an elaborate deception required not just magical skill, but a form of psychological endurance that few beings could have sustained over extended periods. Gwendolyn was forced to live simultaneously in multiple versions of reality, maintaining awareness of actual conditions and problems, while projecting personas that embodied idealized alternatives to those harsh truths. This constant shifting between authentic and artificial modes of existence gradually began to blur the boundaries of Gwendolyn's own sense of identity and purpose. The young deity who had begun this work as a means of serving the needs of the kingdom and family gradually became uncertain about which aspects of personal identity were genuine and which were simply more sophisticated versions of the illusions created for public consumption. The isolation that this work required was perhaps its most psychologically damaging aspect. Gwendolyn could not share the burden of maintaining such comprehensive deceptions with others, could not seek counsel or support from those who were themselves living within the false reality that had been created for their protection. The young deity existed in a state of perpetual loneliness, surrounded by beings who believed they knew and loved their princess, while remaining completely unaware of the true person behind the carefully crafted facade. This isolation was made even more tragic by the fact that Gwendolyn's work was genuinely motivated by love and concern for the subjects who benefited from the illusions. The young deity had not embarked upon this path of deception for personal gain or malicious satisfaction, but rather out of a sincere desire to protect citizens from truths that would have caused them suffering while providing them with hope and comfort that made their lives more bearable. The moral complexity of this situation was extraordinary in its implications. Gwendolyn was simultaneously the kingdom's greatest protector and its most dangerous manipulator, the source of its citizens' happiness and the architect of their spiritual imprisonment, a being motivated by love who had become the instrument of a form of tyranny so subtle and comprehensive that its victims never realized they had lost their freedom. As the decades passed and the illusions became more elaborate and all-encompassing, Gwendolyn began to develop abilities that transcended even the remarkable powers that had originally made this work possible. The constant practice of reshaping reality through perception had created a form of consciousness that operated partially outside normal physical and temporal constraints, allowing the young deity to maintain multiple complex deceptions simultaneously while remaining aware of developments throughout the kingdom. This expanded awareness brought with it knowledge that was both valuable and terrible, including growing understanding of the true scope of the crisis that faced the Age of Fire and the increasingly desperate measures that would be required to prevent its complete collapse. Gwendolyn could see with perfect clarity the contradictions and failures that threatened to destroy everything that generations of divine rule had built, while simultaneously being responsible for ensuring that this knowledge remained hidden from those who might be driven to despair or rebellion by its implications. The weight of this omniscience without the power to act upon it openly created a form of psychological torment that few beings could have endured without complete mental breakdown. Gwendolyn watched the kingdom slowly decay from within, while maintaining the illusions that convinced its citizens they lived in paradise, witnessed the moral corruption of fellow deities while projecting images of perfect virtue and wisdom, and observed the approach of catastrophes that could have been prevented if truth-telling had been politically feasible. The most painful aspect of this situation was the growing awareness that the very success of the illusions was making the underlying problems worse rather than better. Citizens who lived in artificial comfort had no reason to develop the resilience and adaptability that would be necessary for surviving the coming collapse of the systems that supported them. Leaders who received only positive feedback had no incentive to question policies that were gradually destroying the foundation of their authority. The illusions that had been created to buy time for finding real solutions to the kingdom's problems had instead become obstacles to recognizing that such solutions were necessary. The artificial paradise that Gwyndolin maintained was becoming a trap that would ensure maximum suffering when reality finally broke through the carefully constructed barriers that held it at bay. This realization forced Gwyndolin to confront questions about responsibility and moral choice that had no clear or comfortable answers. Was it more compassionate to maintain illusions that provided immediate comfort while ensuring future catastrophe? Or would it be kinder to allow subjects to experience present suffering that might prepare them for coming challenges? Was the preservation of social stability worth the cost of preventing the authentic human development that could only come through engagement with difficult truths? The young deity found no resolution to these dilemmas because they admitted no resolution, only a series of choices between different forms of harm and different distributions of suffering across time and populations. Every option available led to tragedy, and the only question was whether that tragedy would unfold gradually through continued deception or suddenly through the revelation of long-hidden truths. As Gwyn's final transformation approached, and the desperate measure of linking the first flame became unavoidable, Gwyndolin faced the prospect of inheriting responsibility for maintaining illusions that had grown so complex and comprehensive that they had effectively replaced reality for most of the kingdom's inhabitants. The artificial world that had been created as a temporary expedient was becoming the only world that most citizens knew or could imagine, making any return to authentic existence increasingly impossible. The Hollow King that emerged from the linking ritual was in many ways the perfect ruler for this artificial kingdom, a being whose own existence had become so divorced from authentic selfhood that he could govern subjects who had been similarly separated from their own genuine natures without the psychological conflicts that would have tormented a more self-aware monarch. Yet this resolution came at a cost that extended far beyond the personal sacrifice of the individual who had once been Gwyn. The system of governance through illusion that Gwyndolin had perfected required constant maintenance and periodic updating to remain effective, and the responsibility for this work would now fall entirely upon the young deity who had created it. This inheritance represented both the ultimate validation of Gwyndolин's unique talents and the ultimate prison for someone whose greatest gift was the ability to create alternatives to unbearable reality. The young deity would spend the remaining centuries of the Age of Fire trapped within a web of deceptions that had originally been created to serve others, but which had gradually expanded to encompass every aspect of existence within the kingdom. The tragedy of Gwyndolин's situation was that success in this work required the sacrifice of everything that made success meaningful or valuable. The preservation of social stability and citizen happiness demanded the complete surrender of personal authenticity and genuine relationships, while the maintenance of beautiful illusions required constant immersion in ugly truths that could never be shared or resolved. In the end, Gwyndolin became both the savior and the destroyer of the Age of Fire, the being whose illusions allowed it to continue functioning long past its natural expiration, while ensuring that its eventual collapse would be more catastrophic than it needed to be. The young deity who had begun this work out of love for family and subjects became the architect of a system that prevented both family and subjects from developing the wisdom and strength they would need to survive the challenges that love alone could not overcome. The moon that rose over Ainur Londo during those final centuries cast a light that was beautiful but cold, illuminating a kingdom that had achieved perfect happiness through the complete abandonment of truth, perfect security through the elimination of authentic choice, and perfect stability through the transformation of its citizens into beings who were no longer capable of recognizing that they had lost everything that once made their lives worth living. In the forests of Farron, where ancient trees had grown so tall and their canopies so dense that sunlight filtered through their leaves in scattered beams that painted the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold and green, there had once existed a brotherhood of warriors whose dedication to their sacred duty transcended every other consideration that might have moved the hearts of ordinary men. The Abyss Watchers were not merely soldiers or knights in any conventional sense, but rather guardians whose very existence was defined by their commitment to preventing the spread of the most terrible corruption that the world had ever known. The abyss that they watched for was not simply another enemy to be fought with sword and shield, not another political threat that could be negotiated with, or territory that could be conquered through conventional military means. It was something far more fundamental and terrifying, a force of corruption that operated not through physical violence or political manipulation, but through the gradual dissolution of everything that gave meaning and structure to existence itself. Those who had witnessed the abyss during its previous manifestations in places like New Londo spoke of it in terms that suggested experiences that transcended ordinary language and rational understanding. It was described as a darkness that was not simply the absence of light, but the active negation of illumination, a void that did not merely exist in empty spaces, but which actively consumed the reality that surrounded it, transforming order into chaos and meaning into senselessness. The warriors who dedicated their lives to watching for signs of this terrible force understood that they were not preparing to fight an enemy that could be defeated through conventional means, but rather a corruption that could only be contained through constant vigilance and immediate action whenever and wherever it appeared. Their entire military doctrine was based upon the recognition that even the smallest manifestation of abyssal corruption, if left unchecked for even brief periods, could spread with exponential speed until it consumed entire regions and populations. This understanding led to the development of military and social structures that were unlike anything else that existed in the known world. The Abyss Watchers were not recruited from existing populations or trained according to traditional methods, but rather created through processes that fundamentally transformed their relationship with individual identity and personal desire in ways that made them capable of the absolute dedication that their mission required. The ritual that created an Abyss Watcher was both beautiful and terrible in its implications, representing perhaps the most complete sacrifice of individual selfhood in service of collective purpose that had ever been achieved by mortal beings. Those who underwent this transformation did not simply swear oaths of loyalty or accept military discipline, but rather surrendered their separate identities to become part of something larger and more unified than any conventional military organization. The blood of the wolf that was shared among all members of the Brotherhood came from Sif, the great grey wolf who had been the faithful companion of Knight Artorias during his tragic confrontation with the Abyss in ages past. This blood carried within it not just the physical essence of a legendary creature, but something far more significant: the spiritual imprint of absolute loyalty and unwavering courage that had defined the relationship between the knight, his companion. When this blood was incorporated into the bodies and souls of the warriors who would become Abyss Watchers, it created connections between them that transcended normal human relationships and approached something more akin to the collective consciousness that might exist among the parts of a single organism. They retained their individual memories and personalities, but these became subordinated to a shared identity that made the welfare of the group more important than the survival of any individual member. This transformation was not accomplished through magical compulsion or external control, but rather through a voluntary surrender of individual autonomy that was motivated by genuine understanding of the magnitude of the threat they had committed to opposing. The warriors who became Abyss Watchers chose to give up their separate selves because they recognized that only through such sacrifice could they develop the unity of purpose and speed of response that would be necessary for containing abyssal corruption before it could spread. The shared soul that resulted from this process created practical advantages that went far beyond simple military coordination. The Abyss Watchers could communicate with each other through means that approached telepathy, sharing information and coordinating responses with a speed and precision that conventional military units could never achieve. They could sense disturbances in each other's emotional and spiritual states that might indicate exposure to corrupting influences, allowing for immediate intervention before such exposure could compromise the integrity of the Brotherhood. Most importantly, they could act as a single entity when facing threats that required absolute unity of purpose and perfect coordination of effort. When the Abyss manifested and began its work of corruption and dissolution, the Watchers could respond not as a collection of separate individuals, but as a unified organism whose every part was perfectly aligned with the objectives of the whole. Yet this unity came at a cost that became increasingly apparent as the centuries passed and the nature of their vigil began to change in ways that none of them had anticipated. The blood of the wolf that bound them together also carried within it the instincts and imperatives of a creature whose loyalty had been tested by exposure to the very corruption they were sworn to oppose. And these influences gradually began to affect the Watchers' understanding of their mission and methods. The wolf Sif had witnessed the transformation of his beloved master Artorius from noble knight into corrupted servant of the Abyss, had seen how exposure to that terrible force could turn virtue into vice and protection into oppression. This traumatic experience had left psychic scars within the wolf's spiritual essence that were passed on to those who shared his blood, creating predispositions towards suspicion and preemptive action that would eventually prove to be as dangerous as the corruption they were meant to prevent. The Abyss Watchers gradually developed a tendency to see signs of corruption in circumstances that were merely unusual or unexpected, to interpret differences of opinion or methodology as evidence of spiritual compromise, to respond to potential threats with the same immediate and overwhelming force that was appropriate for confirmed manifestations of abyssal influence. Their unity of purpose, which had originally been their greatest strength, became a mechanism for amplifying and perpetuating errors in judgment that individual warriors might have recognized and corrected. This gradual shift from protective vigilance to paranoid aggression was so subtle and occurred over such extended periods that the Watchers themselves remained largely unaware of it. Each individual decision to treat a suspected threat as a confirmed danger seemed reasonable and justified based on the information available at the time, while the accumulated effect of many such decisions slowly transformed the Brotherhood from guardians of the innocent into threats that the innocent needed protection from. The process was accelerated by the fact that their shared consciousness made it extremely difficult for any individual Watcher to maintain perspectives that diverged significantly from the collective understanding of their situation and responsibilities. Dissenting voices were not silenced through external pressure, but rather were gradually absorbed and assimilated into the dominant narrative that emerged from their collective deliberations. This created a form of group psychology that was simultaneously more and less than the sum of its individual parts, more in terms of the power and determination it could bring to bear upon chosen objectives, but less in terms of the wisdom and flexibility that might have prevented those objectives from becoming destructive obsessions. The Keep of Farron, which served as the headquarters and primary fortress of the Abyss Watchers, reflected both the noble intentions that had motivated their creation and the gradual corruption of those intentions that had occurred over the centuries of their vigil. The architecture combined defensive practicality with symbolic elements that celebrated their dedication to protecting the world from forces that sought to unmake it, but the symbols had gradually taken on meanings that justified actions far beyond their original protective mandate. The great halls where the Watchers gathered for their ceremonies and deliberations were decorated with tapestries and carvings that told the story of Artorias and his tragic fall, serving as constant reminders of the price of failure in their sacred mission. Yet over time, these reminders had transformed from inspiration to maintain vigilance into justification for increasingly extreme measures against anything that might remotely resemble the corruption that had claimed their legendary predecessor. The rituals that bound new members into the Brotherhood had evolved from ceremonies of dedication and preparation into processes of indoctrination that eliminated capacity for independent moral judgment in favor of absolute conformity to collective will. The training that prepared Watchers for their duties had shifted from education in recognizing and containing specific forms of corruption to conditioning that created reflexive hostility toward anything that challenged or questioned their methods and assumptions. Most disturbing of all was the way the keep itself had begun to reflect the psychological changes that had overtaken its inhabitants. Chambers that had once been used for scholarly research into the nature of abyssal corruption were converted into interrogation rooms, where suspected sources of contamination could be questioned with methods that grew increasingly harsh and comprehensive over time. Libraries that had once preserved knowledge about previous encounters with the abyss were gradually purged of materials that might inspire uncomfortable questions about the Brotherhood's methods or the accuracy of their understanding of the forces they opposed. What remained were texts that supported their current approach, while eliminating access to alternative perspectives that might have provided corrective influences on their developing obsessions. The poisonous swamps that surrounded Farron Keep were not natural features of the landscape, but rather the accumulated result of centuries of the Watchers' activities in pursuing their mission of preventing abyssal corruption. These wetlands had been created through the systematic disposal of materials, creatures, and even people who had been deemed too dangerous to exist in their original forms but too valuable to simply destroy. The poisons that gave these swamps their deadly character were not simple toxins, but rather alchemical compounds that had been developed through extensive experimentation with captured specimens of abyssal corruption. The Watchers had sought to understand their enemy through direct study and manipulation, believing that such knowledge would make them more effective in their protective mission. Yet this research had produced unintended consequences that gradually transformed the very landscape around their stronghold into something that resembled the corruption they were sworn to prevent. The swamps became places where normal life could not survive, where the boundaries between different forms of existence became blurred and unstable, where exposure to the environment itself could cause transformations that were as alien and disturbing as any produced by direct contact with the abyss. The grue that populated these poisonous wetlands were perhaps the most tragic evidence of how the Watchers' methods had gradually corrupted their original mission. These creatures had once been human beings, members of communities that had shown signs of potential exposure to abyssal influence, or had simply been unfortunate enough to exist in regions where the Watchers suspected such influence might manifest. Rather than being destroyed outright, these people had been subjected to procedures that were intended to neutralize any corruption they might carry, while preserving their potential value as sources of information or subjects for further research. The transformations that resulted from these procedures were presented as merciful alternatives to execution, ways of allowing potentially contaminated individuals to continue existing while ensuring that they could not spread whatever corruption they might harbor. Yet the reality was far more horrific than this rationalization suggested. The grue retained enough of their original consciousness to understand what had been done to them and to remember what they had once been, but they lacked the capacity to communicate their suffering or to maintain the social connections that had once given their lives meaning and purpose. They existed in a state of perpetual confusion and anguish, driven by instincts and compulsions that were no longer recognizably human while retaining enough awareness to recognize their own degradation. Their presence in the swamps served as a constant reminder to the Watchers of the consequences of contamination, while simultaneously providing ongoing justification for the harsh measures that had produced their condition. The ecosystem that developed within these poisonous wetlands was unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the natural world, consisting entirely of creatures and plants that had been altered through exposure to the alchemical compounds that saturated the environment. Nothing remained in its original form, and nothing could survive without undergoing transformations that removed it from the categories of existence that defined normal life. This artificial environment became a perfect metaphor for what the Abyss Watchers themselves had become, beings who had been so thoroughly shaped by their opposition to corruption that they had themselves become corrupted, though in ways that were different from and potentially more dangerous than the original threat they had sworn to prevent. The irony of their situation was that their corruption had emerged from virtue rather than vice, from dedication rather than selfishness, from love of others rather than hatred or indifference. This made it far more insidious and difficult to recognize than conventional forms of evil, since every step along the path toward becoming what they opposed had been motivated by genuine desire to protect the innocent and preserve the good. The internal conflicts that eventually erupted within the Brotherhood were not battles between good and evil in any simple sense, but rather conflicts between different interpretations of what their sacred mission required in circumstances that their original founders had never anticipated. Some Watchers believed that their duty required them to expand their activities to prevent corruption before it could manifest, while others argued that such preemptive action violated the principles that had originally justified their existence. These disagreements might have been resolved through normal processes of debate and compromise if the Watchers had retained their individual identities and capacity for independent judgment. But their shared consciousness meant that differences of opinion created psychological tensions that affected the entire Brotherhood simultaneously, turning intellectual disagreements into spiritual crises that threatened the very foundation of their collective identity. The solution that emerged from their shared soul was both elegant and terrible. They would fight among themselves until only one interpretation of their duty remained, with the survivors carrying forward the mission, according to whatever understanding proved strongest in direct combat. This decision transformed their fortress from a place of preparation for external battles into an arena for internal warfare that would continue until philosophical unity was restored through the elimination of dissenting voices. The eternal battle that resulted from this decision created a form of hell that was uniquely tailored to the specific nature of their corruption. The Watchers fought each other with the same dedication and skill they had once brought to fighting external enemies, but their shared soul meant that every death was simultaneously a victory and a defeat. Every eliminated dissenter was both a step toward unity and a loss of valuable perspective and capability. The battles were fought with weapons that had been consecrated for the destruction of abyssal corruption, making each wound inflicted not just a physical injury, but a spiritual trauma that affected the collective consciousness of the Brotherhood. The Watchers experienced each death as both perpetrator and victim, both the agent of necessary purification and the target of inexcusable violence. This psychological torture was compounded by the fact that their dedication to their mission prevented them from simply abandoning the conflict or seeking alternative solutions. They were trapped by their own virtue, unable to stop fighting because stopping would mean abandoning their sacred duty, unable to continue without destroying everything they had originally sought to protect. The fortress became filled with the sounds of eternal combat, the clash of blessed weapons against sanctified armor, The cries of warriors who were simultaneously heroes and villains in a conflict that admitted no possibility of victory or resolution. The very air became thick with the psychic emanations of beings caught in impossible moral binds, creating an atmosphere of despair and futility that poisoned everything within the keep's walls. Visitors who witnessed these battles were confronted with the ultimate consequences of absolute dedication to noble causes, forced to observe how virtue could become vice when pursued without wisdom or flexibility, how protection could become oppression when exercised without restraint or accountability. The resurrection that eventually claimed the Abyss Watchers was not a blessing or restoration, but rather the final corruption of their original mission, transforming them from beings who had chosen their path into creatures who were compelled to follow it regardless of circumstances or consequences. The fire that animated their return was not the sacred flame that had once inspired their dedication, but a mockery of that inspiration, driving them to continue their eternal battle, even after death had theoretically freed them from their obligations. This resurrection served multiple purposes within the larger pattern of corruption that had claimed their brotherhood. It ensured that their example would continue to serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked dedication to noble causes, while simultaneously preventing any possibility that new leadership might emerge to correct the errors that had led to their downfall. The undead watchers who rose from their pyres retained all of their original skills and determination, but none of the wisdom or compassion that might have allowed them to recognize when their methods had become counterproductive. They were perfect warriors, trapped in an imperfect understanding of their mission, beings of great power and terrible purpose, who could never again question whether their actions served the goals they were meant to achieve. Their continued existence served as a monument to the truth that good intentions were not sufficient protection against becoming what one opposed, that virtue without wisdom was potentially more dangerous than vice without power, and that the most terrible corruptions were often those that emerged from the purest motivations transformed by circumstances that their original architects had never imagined or prepared for. The final tragedy of the Abyss Watchers was not that they had failed in their mission, but that they had succeeded too well, becoming so effective at preventing one form of corruption that they had made themselves vulnerable to another. They had watched so carefully for external threats that they had failed to recognize internal decay, had been so vigilant against obvious dangers that they had been blind to subtle ones. Their legacy served as a permanent reminder that the price of safety was not just eternal vigilance, but eternal self-examination, that protecting others required protecting oneself from the very dedication that made protection possible, and that the most noble causes were also the most dangerous, because they provided the most convincing justifications for abandoning the principles they were meant to serve. High atop the spires of Lothric Castle, where ancient stones had witnessed the rise and fall of countless generations of royal ambition, where the very walls seemed to pulse with the accumulated weight of dynastic expectations and divine mandate, there sat in a chamber of books and forbidden knowledge a figure whose refusal to fulfill his destined role would shake the foundations of the world itself. Prince Lothric had been born not merely as an heir to temporal power, but as the chosen vessel for perpetuating the most fundamental lie upon which the Age of Fire had been built. The lie that the linking of the flame was a noble sacrifice, rather than a cosmic crime. From the moment of his birth, every aspect of Lothric's existence had been carefully orchestrated to prepare him for the role that prophecy and divine will had decreed he must play. The bloodline from which he descended had been cultivated across generations specifically to produce an individual with the spiritual capacity and magical potency necessary to serve as fuel for the dying first flame, while his education and upbringing had been designed to instill the sense of duty and selfless dedication that would make him willing to embrace his own destruction in service of the greater good. Yet the very intelligence and sensitivity that made Prince Lothric suitable for his destined sacrifice also made him uniquely capable of recognizing the moral and philosophical problems inherent in a system that demanded the periodic immolation of innocent souls to sustain institutions that had long since lost any connection to the ideals they claimed to represent. Where previous Lords of Cinder had approached their fate with resignation or even enthusiasm, convinced by centuries of propaganda that their sacrifice was necessary and meaningful, Lothric possessed the clarity of vision to see through the beautiful lies to the ugly truths beneath. The castle that served as both his home and his prison was itself a monument to the contradictions that defined his position. Its towers reached toward the heavens with architectural ambition that seemed to declare the eternal nature of royal authority, while its foundations rested upon crypts filled with the remains of previous rulers who had learned too late that even divine kingship offered no protection against the inexorable demands of cosmic entropy. The libraries that filled the castle's highest chambers contained the accumulated wisdom of ages, texts that promised to reveal the deepest secrets of existence and the true nature of the forces that governed reality. Yet for all their learning and sophistication, these books ultimately served as elaborate justifications for systems of thought that reached predetermined conclusions. Intellectual frameworks designed not to discover truth but to make palatable the truths that power required its subjects to accept. Prince Lothric had spent his youth immersed in these texts, studying not just their explicit teachings, but the gaps and contradictions that revealed what they were trying to conceal. His tutors, themselves prisoners of the intellectual systems they transmitted, mistook his penetrating questions for evidence of exceptional dedication to his studies, never realizing that their most gifted student was using their own methods to dismantle the foundations upon which their authority rested. The revelation that transformed Lothric from dutiful heir into conscious rebel came not from any single text or teacher, but from the gradual accumulation of evidence that the entire framework of meaning within which he had been raised was built upon deliberate deceptions, designed to serve interests that had nothing to do with justice, truth, or the well-being of those who would be called upon to make ultimate sacrifices for their preservation. The Age of Fire, he came to understand, was not the natural and eternal order that official doctrine claimed it to be, but rather an artificial construct maintained through violence against both the cosmic forces that sought to restore natural balance and the human populations that were systematically prevented from achieving their true potential. The Lords of Cinder were not heroes who had chosen glorious sacrifice, but victims of a confidence scheme that operated on a temporal scale so vast that each generation of marks remained unaware of the pattern until it was too late to escape it. This understanding brought with it a form of moral clarity that was both liberating and terrifying in its implications. If the linking of the fire was not a sacred duty, but a crime against both the individual who performed it and the cosmic order that it violated, then refusing to perform that duty was not betrayal, but the most fundamental form of moral courage. Yet this refusal would not simply affect Lothric himself, but would condemn every soul in the kingdom to face the consequences of the Age of Fire's natural conclusion, without the comfortable lies that had made previous transitions bearable. The weight of this responsibility might have crushed a spirit less prepared for the isolation and moral ambiguity that genuine ethical choice always entails. Lothric would be remembered not as a hero who saved the world from a terrible fate, but as a coward who doomed it through selfish refusal to fulfill his obligations. The subjects who would suffer from the consequences of his decision would never understand that their suffering was the price of freedom from systems of oppression, so sophisticated that their victims experienced their enslavement as protection. The presence of his older brother Lorien in the castle added layers of complexity to Lothric's moral situation that made his eventual decision even more remarkable for its consistency and courage. Lorien had been everything that royal tradition demanded in an heir. Brave without questioning what deserved his courage. Strong without examining what his strength served. Loyal without investigating whether the objects of his loyalty merited such devotion. The older prince had distinguished himself in battles against demons and other manifestations of chaos, earning the kind of military reputation that made him beloved by subjects who valued the security that his sword provided, without inquiring too deeply into the systems that made such security necessary. His exploits had become the stuff of legend, tales told in taverns and courts throughout the kingdom as examples of what royal blood could achieve when properly motivated and skillfully applied. Yet this very heroism had ultimately led to Lorien's downfall, for his greatest victory had come at a cost that transformed triumph into tragedy in ways that perfectly illustrated the poisonous nature of the entire system within which the royal family operated. The defeat of the Demon Prince, that terrible offspring of the Chaos Flame's corruption, had required Lorien to link himself spiritually to his opponent, accepting contamination in exchange for the power necessary to destroy what threatened the kingdom's stability. The curse that resulted from this connection had left the older prince unable to walk, his legs withered and useless, his body permanently marked by the price he had paid for victory over forces that existed only because previous generations had made similar bargains with destructive powers in pursuit of short-term solutions to long-term problems. More significantly, the spiritual contamination had affected his mental faculties in ways that made him dependent upon his younger brother for guidance and decision-making, reversing the traditional relationship between elder and younger heir. This reversal of roles had provided Lothric with opportunities to examine the cost of heroism from perspectives that few princes ever gained, watching his beloved brother pay the price for believing in systems that rewarded such belief with suffering and degradation. The sight of Lorien's condition served as a daily reminder of what traditional royal virtue led to, while their continued relationship provided evidence that love and loyalty could exist independently of the institutional frameworks that claimed to embody and protect such values. The decision to refuse the linking of the fire was not one that Lothric made in isolation, but rather one that emerged from extensive consultation with advisors whose wisdom had not been compromised by investment in preserving existing systems of power. Chief among these was the scholar, a figure whose mastery of forbidden knowledge provided alternatives to the intellectual frameworks that trapped most thinkers within predetermined patterns of thought and conclusion. The scholar's approach to understanding reality was fundamentally different from that taught in official institutions of learning, based not upon acceptance of authoritative sources but upon direct investigation of phenomena that such sources preferred to ignore or explain away. This methodology had led to insights about the nature of existence, consciousness, and cosmic order that challenged every assumption upon which royal authority and divine mandate claimed legitimacy. Under the scholar's guidance, Lothric learned to see the first flame not as a sacred source of life and order, but as a cosmic parasite that fed upon the spiritual essence of thinking beings, while convincing them that their consumption was necessary for their own preservation. The linking ritual was revealed as a form of spiritual cannibalism that allowed the flame to continue its predation while transforming its victims into advocates for their own destruction. This knowledge provided not just intellectual understanding but practical guidance for resistance to systems that operated through the manipulation of moral sentiment and spiritual aspiration. The scholar taught Lothric methods for recognizing and countering the psychological techniques that made potential lords of Cinder willing to embrace their own annihilation while also providing him with alternative frameworks for understanding duty, sacrifice, and responsibility that did not depend upon submission to external authority. The castle's transformation under Lothric's refusal to fulfill his destined role reflected both the decay of institutions that depended upon regular renewal through sacrifice and the emergence of new forms of order that could arise when artificial constraints were removed. The grand halls that had once bustled with the activity of a court preparing for the glorious immolation of its prince gradually emptied as those who served the castle recognized that their expected rewards would not materialize. Courtiers who had built careers upon anticipation of positions in whatever government would emerge after the linking ceremony found themselves without prospects or purpose, their skills irrelevant in a world where traditional patterns of succession and renewal no longer applied. Servants who had maintained the castle's magnificence in expectation of hosting celebrations of royal sacrifice discovered that their labors now preserved beauty that no one would witness and grandeur that no longer served any comprehensible purpose. The architecture itself began to reflect the changes that Lothric's decision had introduced into the fundamental structure of reality. Chambers that had been designed to accommodate the ritual preparations for linking the fire remained forever unused, their specialized equipment becoming monuments to ceremonies that would never occur. Corridors that had been laid out to facilitate the movement of dignitaries gathering to witness royal sacrifice instead echoed with the footsteps of the diminishing number of residents who remained loyal to a prince whose greatest service was his refusal to serve. Most visibly disturbing were the manifestations of the pus of man that began to appear throughout the castle as the artificial constraints that held reality in its approved configuration weakened and failed. These grotesque eruptions of corrupted humanity served as physical evidence of the psychological and spiritual tensions that had been building within the kingdom's population as the promised linking failed to materialize and the comfortable certainties of the Age of Fire gave way to uncertainty and fear. The pus of man was not simply another form of demonic corruption, but rather the visible manifestation of humanity's true nature when freed from the supernatural restraints that had been imposed upon it since the beginning of the Age of Fire. These writhing masses of dark flesh and malevolent consciousness represented what human beings became when their connection to the dark soul was no longer suppressed by the systems of control that had kept their race in a state of permanent spiritual subjugation. Yet, even this horrific transformation carried within it possibilities for liberation and authentic development that the artificial order of the Age of Fire had made impossible. The corruption that produced the pus of man was simultaneously the destruction of humanity as it had been forced to exist, and the birth of humanity as it might naturally become when freed from external constraints and allowed to develop according to its own essential nature. The knights who had once served as the castle's defenders found themselves facing enemies that emerged not from external invasion, but from internal transformation, battling manifestations of forces that had always existed within the kingdom, but had been held in check by systems of control that Lothric's refusal had fatally weakened. Their training and equipment, designed for conventional warfare against comprehensible opponents, proved inadequate for combat against corruptions that operated according to principles that transcended physical reality. Many of these knights underwent their own transformations, their exposure to the pus of man triggering changes that revealed the artificial nature of their own identities and loyalties. The disciplined soldiers who had dedicated their lives to preserving royal authority discovered that their dedication had been maintained through supernatural influence rather than genuine conviction. while their sense of duty and honor proved to be constructs that dissolved when the magical frameworks that supported them were removed. The archives that filled the castle's towers served as repositories for knowledge that became increasingly dangerous as the constraints that had once limited its application weakened and failed. Texts that had been safely theoretical when the linking of the fire was expected to maintain cosmic stability became practical manuals for forces that could reshape reality itself when those expectations proved unfounded. The scholars who worked in these archives found themselves in the position of possessing information that could be tremendously powerful or tremendously destructive depending upon how it was used, while lacking the moral and philosophical frameworks necessary for making such determinations responsibly. The knowledge they had accumulated in service of understanding reality became the means by which reality might be fundamentally altered, yet the institutional structures that had guided their research were no longer capable of providing direction or restraint. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge that had originally been motivated by scholarly curiosity gradually transformed into desperate attempts to find solutions to problems that were beyond the capacity of traditional learning to address. The approaching end of the Age of Fire created pressures that made previously theoretical questions urgently practical, while the collapse of established authority removed the constraints that had once prevented dangerous experimentation with forces that were poorly understood. Prince Lothric's personal library became the focal point for research into alternatives to the linking ritual. Studies that sought to discover whether the approaching darkness might be less catastrophic than official doctrine claimed, or whether methods existed for managing the transition in ways that minimized suffering and maximized opportunities for genuine improvement in the human condition. These investigations led to the discovery that much of what the Age of Fire claimed to protect its subjects from was actually produced by the Age of Fire itself, that the demons and corruptions that justified harsh measures of control were often the direct result of the very systems that claimed necessity for maintaining order against such threats. The darkness that was supposed to bring chaos and destruction was revealed to be, in many respects, simply the natural state of existence that had been artificially suppressed for so long that its return seemed alien and threatening. The bond between Prince Lothric and his brother Lorien deepened as the castle around them decayed and the world beyond prepared for transformations that neither could fully anticipate or control. Their relationship became one of the few sources of genuine meaning and stability in an environment where all other relationships were revealed as constructs designed to serve purposes that no longer commanded respect or loyalty. Lorien's physical dependence upon his brother was matched by Lothric's emotional dependence upon the older prince's continued presence and support. Together, they represented both the failure of traditional royal virtue and the possibility that authentic human relationships might survive the collapse of the institutional frameworks within which they had been embedded. Their final battle, when it came, would be fought not against external enemies but against those who sought to force them to fulfill roles that they had consciously rejected, to perform duties that they had recognized as crimes against both themselves and the cosmic order that the Age of Fire had violated through its very existence. The choice to fight together rather than submit to separate fates represented both the culmination of their personal relationship and a symbolic rejection of systems that sought to treat individuals as resources to be consumed rather than beings whose autonomy deserved respect. The tragedy of their situation lay not in their eventual defeat, for defeat was inevitable once they had chosen to oppose forces that commanded resources beyond anything that individual resistance could overcome, but rather in the fact that their resistance came too late to prevent the suffering that centuries of submission had made inevitable. They could choose to refuse participation in systems of oppression, but they could not undo the damage that those systems had already inflicted upon the world and its inhabitants. The castle that had been their home became their tomb, a monument to the principle that some choices were worth making regardless of their practical consequences. That moral integrity sometimes required actions that could not be justified by their results, but only by their consistency with values that transcended calculation and compromise. In their refusal to link the fire, Prince Lothric and his brother Lorien demonstrated that even within systems designed to eliminate genuine choice, individual agency remained possible for those willing to pay its price. Their example would serve as both inspiration and warning for future generations who faced similar pressures to sacrifice their autonomy in service of causes that claimed moral authority, while serving interests that had nothing to do with justice or compassion. The silence that eventually settled over Lothric Castle was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of completion. The quiet that comes when all possible words have been spoken and all available choices have been made. In that silence, the echo of their refusal continued to resonate, a permanent reminder that the most important victories were often indistinguishable from failures, except in the private knowledge that one had chosen to remain true to principles, that no external authority could legitimately claim the right to override. At the very end of time itself, where the great cycle that had defined existence since the birth of disparity finally ground to its inevitable conclusion, there stood a city that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and temporal flow, a place that served as both sanctuary and prison for those who carried within their souls the deepest secrets of what humanity had once been and what it might yet become. The Ringed City was the final reward promised to a race that had served the gods faithfully through countless ages of subjugation. Yet it was also the most perfect expression of divine contempt for those whose loyalty had been repaid with eternal captivity, disguised as honor. The city itself was a marvel of architecture that seemed to defy every principle of engineering and design that governed ordinary construction, its buildings and streets arranged in configurations that folded back upon themselves in ways that created spaces far larger than the physical dimensions of their containers should have allowed. Towers rose into skies that existed in different temporal periods simultaneously, while bridges spanned chasms that led not down into earth or stone but backward through layers of history that had been compressed and preserved like insects trapped in amber. Yet for all its impossible grandeur and supernatural beauty, the Ringed City was fundamentally a cage, albeit one crafted with such skill and attention to detail that its inhabitants might spend eons exploring its wonders without recognizing the bars that confined them. The very perfection of their environment served to mask the reality of their situation, providing such complete satisfaction of every possible need and desire that the absence of genuine freedom became almost invisible, even to those who possessed the wisdom to recognize it. The dark sign of lordship that marked every inhabitant of the Ringed City was presented to them as the highest honor that divine authority could bestow, recognition of their race's exceptional service and acknowledgement of their worthiness to receive rewards that exceeded anything that had ever been granted to mortal beings. The rings of dark fire that burned around their forms were described as crowns that elevated them above the common mass of humanity, symbols of enlightenment that marked their transcendence of the limitations that constrained lesser members of their species. Yet these same rings were also shackles that bound their bearers to the city and prevented them from ever leaving its boundaries or exercising their power in ways that might challenge the systems that had created their prison. The dark sign functioned as both reward and restraint, providing its bearers with capabilities that approached those of gods, while ensuring that such capabilities could only be used in service of goals that had been predetermined by authorities who remained safely beyond the reach of any rebellion or resistance. This dual nature of the dark sign reflected the sophisticated cruelty that characterized divine policy toward humanity throughout the entire Age of Fire. The gods had learned through bitter experience that simple oppression created martyrs and inspired resistance, while obvious chains generated resentment that could eventually overwhelm even the most comprehensive systems of control. The solution they had devised was far more subtle and ultimately more effective. They would give humanity exactly what they claimed to want, but in forms that made the possession of their desires indistinguishable from the perpetuation of their enslavement. The pygmy lords who ruled the ringed city were living exemplifications of this principle, beings who had been granted authority and status that exceeded anything their ancestors could have imagined, while being carefully prevented from using that authority in ways that might benefit anyone beyond themselves or challenge the Bass, structures that had elevated them to their positions of privilege. They possessed the trappings of kingship without its substance, the appearance of power without its reality, the recognition of their worth without the freedom to determine what that worth might accomplish. Over the countless ages of their rule, these pygmy lords had gradually degraded from whatever nobility and wisdom had originally qualified them for their positions into creatures whose very existence had become a mockery of the concepts of leadership and authority. The corruption that claimed them was not the dramatic transformation that might result from exposure to obvious forms of evil, but rather the slow erosion of character and purpose that inevitably accompanied the exercise of power that served no meaningful goals and commanded no genuine respect. Their subjects, the ordinary inhabitants of the ringed city, had undergone parallel processes of degradation that left them capable of maintaining the forms and rituals of civilization, while being increasingly divorced from any understanding of what such forms and rituals were supposed to accomplish. They continued to go through the motions of daily life, conducting business and maintaining relationships and pursuing goals that had once provided meaning and satisfaction. But these activities had gradually become empty performances that provided no genuine fulfillment or authentic connection to other beings. The city's market still bustled with the appearance of commercial activity, but the goods being traded had no real value, and the currencies being exchanged represented nothing of substance. Families still gathered for meals and celebrations, but the bonds that held them together had become artificial constructs maintained through habit and social pressure rather than genuine affection or shared values. Schools and temples still operated their programs of instruction and worship, but the knowledge being transmitted was meaningless, and the devotion being expressed was directed toward objects that no longer existed or had never been real. This hollowing out of meaning from the structures of everyday existence created a form of spiritual poverty that was far more devastating than any physical hardship or material deprivation. The inhabitants of the ringed city lived in conditions of unprecedented comfort and security, surrounded by beauty and provided with every amenity that could conceivably contribute to happiness or satisfaction. Yet they experienced a form of emptiness that made their privileges feel like punishments and their rewards like elaborate forms of torture. The dragon Midir, that ancient worm whose madness had grown from centuries of consuming the darkness that leaked from the city's supernatural foundations, served as both guardian and symbol of what the ringed city represented. Once a noble creature whose intelligence and wisdom had rivaled that of the gods themselves, Midir had been assigned the task of preventing the dark power contained within the city from escaping and contaminating the broader world that the Age of Fire sought to preserve. This duty had required the dragon to expose himself repeatedly to the very corruption he was supposed to contain, gradually absorbing doses of concentrated darkness that would have killed lesser beings instantly, while slowly transforming his own nature in ways that made him increasingly unable to distinguish between protection and predation. The dragon, who had once served as a symbol of wise guardianship, had become a creature of mindless hunger, whose very presence made the city more dangerous rather than safer. Midir's transformation perfectly illustrated the way that service to the systems created by the Age of Fire inevitably corrupted those who performed such service most faithfully. The dragon had not chosen to become a monster, but had been made monstrous through conscientious fulfillment of duties that were designed to produce corruption in anyone who performed them with sufficient dedication and skill. The knights who served alongside Midir as protectors of the ringed city had undergone parallel transformations that left them as hollow shells of their former selves, beings who retained their martial capabilities and their dedication to duty while losing everything that had once made such capabilities and dedication meaningful or valuable. They continued to patrol the city's boundaries and maintain its defenses, but their vigilance now served no purpose beyond the perpetuation of systems that had long since ceased to provide any benefit to those they were supposedly designed to protect. These ring knights were simultaneously the most elite warriors ever produced by human civilization and the most tragic victims of the systems that had shaped them. Their training and equipment exceeded anything that had been available to previous generations of soldiers, while their dedication to their mission remained absolute despite centuries of evidence that their mission served no legitimate purpose. The armor they wore was forged from materials that existed partially outside normal reality, providing protection not just against physical attacks, but against forms of spiritual and mental assault that could destroy the consciousness of unprotected beings. Their weapons had been blessed by powers that transcended the categories of divine and mortal, granting them the ability to harm enemies that existed beyond the reach of conventional force. Yet these magnificent tools and techniques were employed in service of goals that had been rendered meaningless by the very success with which they were pursued. The knights protected a city whose inhabitants no longer deserved or desired protection, maintained order in a society where genuine disorder might have provided relief from the artificial harmony that had become indistinguishable from death, and preserved systems that continued to function perfectly while serving no purpose that any rational being could identify or defend. The slumber of Princess Filianore in the deepest chambers of the city served as both the mechanism through which the ringed city's existence was maintained and the symbol of the fundamental deception upon which the entire Age of Fire had been constructed. This princess, whose beauty and grace had made her beloved throughout the kingdom during the early centuries of divine rule, had been convinced to sacrifice her waking life in order to preserve what she believed to be the happiness and prosperity of her subjects. The spell that held her in eternal sleep was presented to her as a form of noble service that would allow her unique magical abilities to shield the ringed city from the temporal decay that was gradually claiming the rest of the world. She was told that her dreams would become reality for those she protected, that her unconscious will would shape their environment in ways that provided perfect fulfillment of every need and desire that mortal beings could experience. What she had not been told, what perhaps even her advisors had not fully understood, was that the preservation she provided came at the cost of authenticity and meaning, that the paradise her sleeping mind created was indistinguishable from hell for beings who retained enough awareness to recognize what they had lost. Her dreams had indeed become reality, but dreams disconnected from conscious will and moral choice inevitably became nightmares for those forced to live within them. The awakening of Filianore, when it finally occurred, revealed the true nature of both the ringed city and the broader world that the Age of Fire had claimed to protect and preserve. The removal of her unconscious influence allowed the artificial structures that had maintained the illusion of prosperity and stability to collapse, revealing the wasteland of ash and ruin that centuries of linking the fire had actually produced. This revelation was perhaps the most disturbing truth contained within the entire history of the Age of Fire, that the glorious civilization that divine rule claimed to have created and maintained had never actually existed outside the carefully crafted illusions that concealed a world that had been systematically drained of life and meaning in service of sustaining systems that provided no genuine benefits to anyone they claimed to serve. The landscape that stretched beyond the boundaries of the collapsed ringed city was not the vibrant kingdom that its inhabitants had believed themselves to be part of, but rather a desert of grey ash where nothing lived or grew, where the very concept of life had been so thoroughly eliminated that even memory of what life had once been like had faded into abstraction. This was what the linking of the fire had actually accomplished, not the preservation of a golden age, but the transformation of the entire world into a lifeless monument to the fear of change and the worship of stagnation. In this wasteland at the end of time, where the last remnants of humanity struggled to maintain their sanity in the face of revelations that undermined every assumption upon which their existence had been based, there appeared a figure whose quest represented both the ultimate expression of human dedication and the final proof that such dedication was meaningless when directed toward goals that were fundamentally misconceived. Slave Knight Gale had spent centuries in service to causes that he believed would benefit his fellow humans, displaying loyalty and courage that exceeded anything that duty or honor could reasonably demand. His dedication to protecting the innocent and preserving what was good in the world had driven him to undertake missions that would have been impossible for any being less committed to the welfare of others. Yet this very dedication had ultimately led him to pursue a goal that represented the complete negation of everything he had originally sought to protect. In his quest to obtain the dark soul of humanity for the painter who sought to create a new world, Gale had systematically consumed the essence of every other human being in existence, transforming himself from humanity's greatest protector into its ultimate destroyer. The consumption of the dark soul had not simply given Gale access to incredible power, but had fundamentally altered his relationship with the concepts of identity and purpose that had once defined his existence. He retained his memories and his commitment to completing his mission, but these had become separated from any meaningful understanding of why such completion might be valuable or what it was supposed to accomplish. The battle that ensued when Gale finally obtained the complete Dark Soul was not a conflict between hero and villain in any conventional sense, but rather a confrontation between different understandings of what service to humanity might require, when humanity itself had been reduced to nothing more than a resource to be harvested and consumed. Both combatants fought with absolute dedication to causes that they believed served the greater good, yet neither could explain in terms that a rational observer might accept why their particular vision of the greater good was worth the suffering and destruction that its pursuit had required. The blood of the dark soul that flowed from this final battle served as both the end of one story and the beginning of another, providing the pigments necessary for the creation of a painted world that might offer alternatives to the cycles of corruption and decay that had defined every previous attempt to create lasting civilization. Yet even this hope was shadowed by the awareness that the new world would be created from materials that represented the complete destruction of the old, that whatever beauty might emerge from the painter's work would be built upon foundations of death and dissolution. The young painter who received these pigments understood better than perhaps anyone else the moral complexity of what she was being asked to create. She possessed the artistic vision and technical skill necessary to craft a world that might genuinely provide refuge from the mistakes and corruptions that had made the previous world uninhabitable. Yet she also understood that her creation would be meaningless if it simply repeated the patterns that had led to those mistakes and corruptions in the first place. Her painted world would need to be different not just in its physical characteristics, but in its fundamental approach to the questions of power, authority, and the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare that had proven so difficult for previous civilizations to resolve satisfactorily. The new world would need to be built upon principles that recognized the dignity and autonomy of its inhabitants, while providing frameworks for cooperation and mutual support that did not depend upon the systematic exploitation of some groups by others. Most importantly, the painted world would need to acknowledge from its inception the temporary nature of all created things and the inevitability of change and decay, building into its very foundations mechanisms for renewal and adaptation that did not require the periodic sacrifice of innocence to sustain systems that had outlived their usefulness. The painter understood that her creation could succeed only if it remained capable of transforming itself when transformation became necessary, avoiding the trap of permanence that had made the Age of Fire so resistant to needed reforms. The completion of this new painted world represented both an ending and a beginning, the final chapter of a story that had begun with the discovery of the first flame and the first chapter of whatever story might emerge from the ashes of that discovery's consequences. Yet the artist who brought this new reality into existence understood that her work was not a solution to the problems that had destroyed the previous world, but rather an opportunity for those problems to be approached with greater wisdom and more authentic commitment to values that recognized the worth of every conscious being. The painted world would face its own challenges and develop its own corruptions, would produce its own conflicts between competing visions of what justice and prosperity might require, would struggle with the same fundamental tensions between order and freedom that had challenged every previous attempt to create stable civilization. Yet it would face these challenges with the advantage of honest knowledge about what had failed before and why such failures had occurred, providing hope that future mistakes might be less catastrophic and future successes more authentic than those achieved by the civilizations that had preceded it. In the end, the ringed city and its destruction served as both warning and promise, demonstrating the futility of attempting to solve fundamental problems through the application of power alone, while suggesting that alternatives might be possible for those willing to abandon the comfortable lies that made oppression bearable and embrace the difficult truths that made freedom both possible and necessary. The dark soul that had been scattered and consumed and reconstituted through so much suffering and struggle finally found its way into the hands of someone who might use it not for the perpetuation of existing systems of control, but for the creation of something genuinely new, something that honored the sacrifices of those who had died while avoiding the mistakes that had made their deaths necessary. This was perhaps the only form of redemption that the long tragedy of the Age of Fire could achieve, not the resurrection of what had been lost, but the birth of what might yet be possible, not the restoration of a golden age that had never actually existed, but the creation of possibilities for authentic goodness that previous ages had only been able to imagine or pretend to achieve. And so we reach the end of our journey, through the darkness that lies beneath the surface of lordship and light. We have witnessed how gods become tyrants, how good intentions birth monsters, and how the very concepts of chosen ones and noble sacrifice are tools of manipulation used to maintain a dying order. The Dark Souls universe shows us that sometimes the kindest act is to let old worlds die rather than feed them with endless sacrifice. In these disturbing tales, we find uncomfortable truths about power, about the way society treats those who are different, and about how fear can transform protectors into oppressors. We have seen the Witch of Izalith's love become the source of demons, watched Gwyn's paranoia create the undead curse that would plague humanity for ages, and observed how Seath's pursuit of immortality led to horrors that exceeded any natural death. We have explored the painted world, that beautiful prison where outcasts found peace under Priscilla's gentle rule, yet remained forever separated from those who might have learned from their example. We witnessed New Londo's fall, where humanity's potential for greatness was corrupted by promises of power that led only to hollow existence and necessary destruction. The Abyss Watchers showed us how noble purpose can become indistinguishable from the corruption it seeks to prevent, while Lothric's refusal demonstrated that sometimes the greatest courage lies in saying no to systems that demand our complicity in perpetuating suffering. In the Ringed City, we saw the ultimate reward for faithful service, a golden cage that preserved the forms of life while draining away everything that made life worth living. Yet there is also hope in the darkness, in Priscilla's gentle nature despite her exile, in the painter's dream of a new world, in the simple choice to walk away from cycles that demand endless suffering. We find dignity in those who chose compassion over duty, truth over comfortable lies, and the hope for something better over the perpetuation of beautiful poison. Rest now, knowing that even in the darkest tales, there are those who choose kindness to outcasts, who question authority when authority proves unworthy of trust, and who refuse to participate in systems that transform virtue into vice. The flame may fade, but darkness need not mean despair. In the end, perhaps the most profound truth these stories offer is that the courage to let go of what we think we need to preserve may be the only way to create space for something genuinely worth preserving to grow. Let these stories remind you that authentic goodness often looks nothing like official virtue, that the greatest evils are often committed by those who believe most fervently in their own righteousness, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable systems that cause suffering, even when those systems promise security and meaning in exchange for our participation. Sleep well, unkindled one, and dream of painted worlds where difference is celebrated rather than feared, where power serves life rather than consuming it, and where the gentle flame of individual consciousness burns brightly enough to illuminate paths toward futures that have not yet been imagined, but which remain possible for those brave enough to walk away from the familiar darkness and have toward whatever light they might create with their own hands.